Okay, that's enough dicking around. I see you all in chat. Being goofy. I can't believe you do this to me. To my channel.
Chippy.
We'll always be here for you, Garnet, whenever you have any kind of reference or description for me to draw. And $23 Canadian, of course. All right, today we are starting with a beautiful, cute tiefling boy. Man, but you know what I mean. Tief boy.
Drowning.
Rad, no! I'm not a lifeguard yet. I can't legally save you. Actually, that's not true. Anybody can be a rescuer. They just have to go by the latter approach, which is to minimize the risk of becoming a victim yourself. What's the latter approach, you ask? I have an exam this Saturday, so that's why I'm going through it. I can't remember. I'm gonna fail that exam. I'm fucked.
I live consuming schoolwork.
Yeah, I think I'll do pretty good. There's a couple of like absolute fail states, but it's like I would not commit those absolute fail states. The worst thing that could happen is I forget like a part of the process, or I do a part of the process out of sync. Which, as long as it's done, generally they either overlook it or they it's a minimal point takeoff. But we are thankfully not some of the other folks in this particular lifeguarding course, because like holy shit, I'll look over and these kids are like staring off into space for 20 minutes at a time, and then we'll ask stupid shit like, what's CPR? Like, maybe not quite that stupid, but really, really, really close. It's incredible. My 23 CAD will empower you. Yes! I'll get shawarma. Let's see if I spill some tea on the goobers that I'm doing lifeguarding with. Well, the week before last, or was it last week, we were doing a 400-meter sprint, or endurance test. I guess it's not a sprint by definition. And me and actually the best swimmer in the group, a guy who actually did water polo, head-on collided. He mistook his lane because someone was close to the wrong lane, and so he corrected. And I was doing a backstroke, so neither of us could see shit. And clunk in the middle of our timed 400 meter. And you know what? I lost a good 30 seconds, and he did too, like checking to make sure each of us was okay, and we're both fine. It was more a surprise than painful. But I still managed to make it under 10 minutes. I think my total time was like 9 minutes 30 or something on that particular run. So we were good. But listen, a lot of these lifeguards or prospective lifeguards are like high school age students. You can be a lifeguard as young as like 15 or something like that. So, whoops. Photoshop. 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 Is it already happening? Okay, no, we're good. It's fine. I think it just opened a dialog box in the wrong window. What was I saying? Yeah, so these are a lot of like high school age kids. So, and this is the weekend. So they're studying all week long. They're doing schoolwork all week long. They're here on their days off. I get it that studying and paying attention is kind of hard for the full, I think it's like 10 hours. Or maybe it's 8 hours. It's 8 hours that we're doing this stuff. But holy fucking shit. Those kids are gonna let somebody drown. I mean, they're not because they're not graduating, but like, oh my gosh. It is. It is tough out there. I want to make this cutie a little bit more stylized. What are we doing here? Let's stylize him a little bit more. God, but they're like asking about the symptoms of a stroke after supposedly completing their standard first aid, and again going through like every stage of getting your lifeguard license or permit or whatever is you are constantly going over for the first aid. The first aid is a major component of the course, and the second major component is like just procedure on blowing your whistle and how to back up other lifeguards and stuff like that. And they don't know anything about strokes.
This bot is alive.
Oh, gamers. Gamers. This is a nightmare. This is horrible. I'm just trying to whine and bitch about lifeguarding and to draw this beautiful tiefling who I'm kind of getting weird with the stylization here. Eyes are too big. I don't think I'll ever be able to quite straddle anime, so we're just gonna pop back into some semi-realism here. But anyway, it was just the parts you missed. The 3 minutes further of me talking was just complaining about lifeguarding, or a lifeguarding class. I'm 99% sure I'll pass. And I'm 99% sure that like 2 other people in the class maybe will pass. And then the other 6 are I don't know, being sent to hell.
Gamer. I'm a little silly. I'm a little stupid. But I'm smart when it comes to rescuing. I'm actually like a genius. They have this one fun carry for drowning or distressed victims. Those are like people who are conscious and like ostensibly fine, but they're just panicking in the water usually. And it's called a football carry. And how you do it is you swim directly at them, dive under the water about 2 meters away so they can't grab you and co-drown you. And you just kind of slam into their chest and grab them around the hips, and you just keep swimming. Your head's underwater, you're holding your breath the whole time, and the person has their head and shoulders above the water. And having the head and shoulders above the water actually like de-panics them. It'll calm them because it feels like, you know, they're actually being rescued. So rather than doing a standard like chin grab, which is a little bit easier on the rescuer, you're getting the situation under control by calming this person down. And you have to be able to swim 5 meters with it. I can do further, but I am apparently very good at it, which is kind of gender. I don't know. I could never play a lifeguard. I'd let them drown. No, your leek became too crisp. That's okay. The cool thing to do with cooking now is to turn is ash, like literally like leaf ash or leek ash. I think I read it in a copy of Bon Appetit or something. I'm gonna make this tiefling cuter, I think, but we're gonna first get like the essentials down, you know? Actually, they're pretty cute. Actually, I have a reference too. Come here, little buddy. You're a very linebacker, but in water. Extremely true. I don't know if my kitchen is so freaking loud if you're quiet. Yeah. I might be quiet here. Let me turn myself up to max. That is all I can do. When I put the History of Rome podcast on, I'll have that up high as well. If I ever see Wawa IRL, can I give you a gentle hug? Of course. But just know that I could break your spine in an instant.
I'm 4'11". You could easily punt me into the sun.
Show me all your lifeguard skills. Yes! I like literally can't wait to get Gianni and like my brother into the water so I can be like, huh, check this shit out, and then fairly certain I saw you at PAX, but didn't know you that year, and Gianni threw a battery into the Haba. What the hell's a Haba? I was on the floor at PAX, kind of wandering around, so you might not have even seen me, but maybe at future excursions, introduce yourself. Remind me who you are, because sometimes I have a hard time connecting names to just if you say you're from Twitch chat, I'll be like, oh yeah. Which one? I'm the goober. Oh yeah. Nice to meet you. Drowns you. I'm only like 100 pounds. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. You're getting like the shoulder carry. I'm carrying you out of there. Issues, yeah. They do happen.
Kill you with one punch. So true. Oh, no, I don't like what I did with the jaw there. Let's make that chin a little bit more pointed. Okay, let's see if I can figure out how to draw a frickin' hood here. Trying to think if I can spill more tea about my lifeguard stuff, or if I just don't really have the brain capacity to talk about it, and should switch to history of Rome. I love talking shit though. Oh, I love talking shit. I was considering studying with you guys, but I don't really know how to functionally do that, so I probably won't. The problem is that the exam is mostly practical, and you need to be in the water to practice most of this stuff. I could go over like first aid or something like that, but even then I think I'm pretty well spick und span on that one. Hot tub lifeguard stream. Yeah. Yeah, school will do that to you. School in like 20s will do that to you. I think I've only just been like getting back to like my relatively normal weight for my size is like 70 pounds or so. Or sorry, 170 pounds, Jesus. But like I'd gone up, I don't know, 20 pounds over COVID, more or less. And actually, I'm not impressed that I've lost a little bit of weight, because I put on maybe 5 of that 190 pounds just in the last year of like basically working out and trying to bulk, which is hard because you have to eat a lot of calories and work out. And it's honestly just hard for me to eat that much. I don't really like eating a lot. And so, oh, the child is outside in the hall. Oh, dear God, he's so loud. So so I started swimming. Oh my God, he's so loud. So I started swimming, and swimming tends to burn some more calories than even like lifting weights. And so I lost, I think 20 pounds, but 10 pounds only in the last couple of months. And I'm like, no, that could be muscle that I'm losing. Like, it's a little bit of the extra fat that I had kind of hanging around, which, whatever. But I'm worried that a lot of it was some of that hard-earned muscle from doing weights. The real answer is I should just get back to doing weights, and then I'll be able to eat more again, but whatever. Yo, I'm the height of a mini fridge, 70 pounds. Came out really cool. Oh, yeah, is this like a pit crew? I absolutely love this pit crew. I should get on pit crews, to be honest. I'm showing off a little bit of kind of like the cute corset under that, because I think it'll accentuate his cute hips a little bit more. Not to put you on blast, but you did put he has cute hips basically in the bio, and I feel like I need to make sure that that's part of his design. But well, you know the drill here. If you see anything that you want done, you can always bring it up. Smallest Dutch woman. Fat plus muscle equals beefy. You're small, Garnet. Or do you mean the 190s? I was going to say, if you're 90 pounds, and well, welcome to the chat, but this is a mature chat, and it sounds like you're about 14 years old. Oh, God. Yeah, I hear you at Rad Beetle. Yeah. Is that for like the Sportsplex?
or for a city of Ottawa pool, because it's a lot simpler if you go in and just go like, I want a membership, and they're like, okay. But yeah, I remember looking at that. It's not great how they format that. In general, the government of Canada is not really good at website design. Gianni, we're talking shit about the government of Canada.
Ooh,
Yeah,
I better be careful what I say on here.
you better, because they're the ones who are compelling you to stream all the time, aren't they? Oh, you're just a short 19-year-old. Okay. Shortest kid in high school. Hey, short kid respect. I was never a short kid, but respect. Grr, want to go to the gym again. Grr. You'll go there eventually when you feel like it. Don't feel put out about it. Gosh. I only started really liking going to the gym when the gym was right there. I hope I'm able to keep up in Ottawa, but I don't think it'll be a problem because I will literally be a lifeguard in Ottawa, and there will be a gym where I work, I presume.
Gianni.
Wait, there are governments that are good at web design? Yeah, you know what? I bet there's like one weird libertarian guy who has like Tedland or something like that in the middle of friggin' Kentucky or something, and I bet he has a good website because he had his nephew design it, his weird furry nephew design it for him. But that's the only one. So if you go down to the Republic of Ted, maybe. Maybe I'll still put some cute bracers on here. Gianni stole my $6 and ran. What the fuck, Gianni? Did he miss one of your a bit donation? That guy's so brainless. We should kill him. And I was like, woof, yeah. I don't know what I'm doing with this hand. I should not be drawing that yet. I'm spacing out a little bit. We started a little bit late too, so we'll be doing the usual working on this for an extra 10 minutes or so past the hour. See, I should stop. Like, I'm focusing on details right now. I'm not actually getting the overall look of this guy out yet. A lot of things could still go wrong, and I'm here like, is the angle of his cloak right? Wrong. I also kind of like this little belt here. What if we never invented belts? What would Dungeons and Dragons and like Final Fantasy characters wear?
It is 1:28.
It's 2:28 for me. 8:30ish.
All right, in a minute I'm going to start up that History of Rome podcast. I am Norsquegian.
Norsqueegee.
More burns than progress. Oh, yeah, baby. Good old hot glue guns. Love those nice little ovoid burns. I think I still have, Actually, I think I still have a couple scars on my forearms from, my cosplay. I don't want to call it a phase, but from when I did some cosplays. Get Europe, idiot. Oh! Yeah, hot glue guns are based, and it's, fun that you can hurt yourself with them. But also, owie. Okay, we're listening to the History of Rome podcast now for real. This one's called The Seven Kings of Rome. I presume it's yeah. So Rome had kings, quote unquote, early in its history. I don't know how many. It says it's 7 kings, so I guess 7 generations of kings. I don't know. Anyway. Excuse me, click. Didn't work.
It didn't fucking work. I fucking had it with you.
Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome.
Why can't I
So
hear
far,
anything?
we have covered 4 of the 7 kings of Rome: Romulus, Numa Pompilius,
What is going
Tullus Hostilius, and Ancus Marcius.
Oh.
Today we will discuss the final 3, the so-called Tarquin dynasty. The father, Tarquinius Priscus, a decent if
Now,
manipulative
can you
king,
still hear me? Yes.
his adopted son and successor, Servius Tullius, and finally his real son, Tarquinius
Rome
Superbus,
is always on
who
my mind,
usurped
Sam.
his adopted brother and was then himself usurped by a fed-up mob, marking him forever with the infamy of being the last king of Rome.
Oh.
Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was born in Tarquini, one of the 12 cities of
Tarquini?
Etruria, the son of a Corinthian exile named Demaratus. Tarquin, the name by which history remembers him, was a shrewd businessman who became wealthy, but due to his racially mixed heritage, he was only admitted so far up the Etruscan social and political ladder. Angered at being denied the respect he felt he deserved, he decided to move to Rome,
Canceling the
a city
Etruscans, they were
famous for
racist.
offering men a fresh start. In Rome, Tarquin made an immediate splash. He gave lavishly,
Is that
funding
the
public
one
projects,
W that
charities,
Rome can
and anything
claim,
else
is
that
that
would
it
bring him
wasn't
renown.
racially
It did not
segregated?
take long for Tarquin to come to the attention of Ancus Marcius, the aging king. In his final years, Ancus brought Tarquin into his confidence,
This is
leading to a close
2011,
relationship
so
that
yeah, he's
resulted
gonna
in
be kinda
Tarquin
close to life.
ultimately being made guardian of Ancus's 2 sons when the king died.
I'll
Tarquin
turn
knew
him
an
down a bit.
opportunity when he saw it, and after Ancus died, he sent the 2 boys away on a hunting trip.
How's this?
He then lobbied the Senate
I just have
hold
to
elections
project
for
if
a
I
new
wanna
king
talk over him.
immediately to avoid any
But I won't
possible
talk
threat
over
to
him.
the city brought on by the
Tired of
Vatican
talking.
leadership. Tarquin had made a lot of friends in the short time he had been in Rome, and his further generosity no doubt convinced any fence-sitters that he was the man for the job. He was selected in a landslide and became the 5th king of Rome. One of his first acts, demonstrating his characteristic shrewdness, was to expand the Senate by another 100 men, bringing their total number to 300. The new senators were wholly obligated to Tarquin for their positions and, predictably, supported him in everything that he did, leaving the Senate little more than a rubber stamp for Tarquin's policies. This could have proven disastrous if Tarquin had been an incompetent or tyrannical leader, but he proved to be a conscientious and able king, both as an administrator and military commander. Soon after his election, Rome found itself at war, again, with some of its Latin neighbors. Tarquin easily routed his opponents and returned to Rome with a great deal of plunder. He decided to celebrate his victory by throwing public games, the likes of which had never been seen. But there was no stadium large enough for Tarquin's vision, so he ordered a hippodrome built between the Palatine and Aventine hills. This hippodrome, when completed, would become known as the Circus Maximus, one of the greatest sports venues in the ancient world. It would remain in continuous use for the 1,000-year existence of the empire. Immediately after work began on the Circus Maximus, Rome found itself embroiled in a fight with the remaining independent Sabine communities. They had never gotten over having half their population annexed by the Romans, and now sought to challenge the upstart for control of the region. Tarquin again led the Romans to victory, defeating the Sabines with strategy as well as brute force. Destroying a bridge the Sabines had used to cross into Roman territory, cutting off any escape route, he then smashed them against the river. To celebrate this victory, Tarquin inaugurated one of the most famous of all Roman traditions, the Triumph. Later years would set guidelines for what constituted an official triumph, but the basic parts were put in place by Tarquin. The leader of the victorious army rides into the city on a chariot drawn by 4 horses. The legions follow
I ever get
with
into
prisoners of
DBD,
the
I would do it
vanquished
for you,
army,
Mint.
and all manner of plunder seized from the
That
enemy.
new guy does look pretty cool, though.
To be
Oh my
awarded
gosh.
a triumph
He's
was
so
the greatest
yucky.
honor a Roman general could receive. More will be said later about the traditional elements of a triumph, so for now we will simply note for trivia's sake that it was Tarquinius Priscus who celebrated the first one. Right around this time, a fantastic story reached the king. The head of a slave's sleeping child had suddenly burst into flames,
Oh.
though the child remained unhurt and did not wake up.
Huh.
Witnesses testified that they had seen the event with their own eyes, and that the flames only disappeared when the child awoke. Tarquin's wife believed it was an omen of the child's future greatness, and implored the king to adopt him so as to invite destiny into their house and not have it break down their doors.
Also, we might have
Tarquin
listened to
agreed, and the
most of this
child,
episode,
Servius Tullius, was adopted by the king.
but
He raised the boy as his own, and the omen bore out as the boy grew into a capable leader and eventual heir apparent to the throne. All was progressing nicely for Tarquin, but trouble was
give me that
brewing.
swim discount.
The sons of Ancus had not forgotten how Tarquin denied them their birthright, and resolved to reclaim what they felt was theirs. Knowing they could
Yeah,
never
get
get
'em.
close to the king, the brothers enticed
It's a City of
2
Ottawa
men to
thing. I
do
wouldn't
their
be
dirty
surprised
work
if they
for
had
them.
accessibility options.
The two
Or they
men arrived at the
fucking
palace and
should.
pretended to have a loud quarrel, eventually demanding the king settle their dispute. Tarquin came to see what all the commotion was about and agreed to settle the fight. But as he
Someone
sat
be
to
zooming.
adjudicate, one of the men pulled out an axe he had hidden in his robe and lodged it in the back of the king's head. Tarquin fell, and the 2 men attempted to escape, but they were immediately captured. Tarquin's wife, Tanaquil, seeing the severity of the wound, immediately cleared the room and brought Servius
Do you want me to
Tullus in
kill them
help
for you,
pretend to the
bemused
king.
illusionist?
Over the body, she told Servius that nothing could be done for Tarquin, but that
Sorry,
it was
wait, I missed it, I
imperative
missed it,
the men
I missed it. What
responsible
happened,
for
what
the
happened, what
crime should
happened?
not sit on the throne, invite
Okay.
destiny into their house, and not have it break down their doors. Tarquin agreed, and the child, Servius Tullius, was adopted by the king. He raised the boy as his own, and the omen bore out as the boy grew into a capable leader and eventual heir apparent to the throne. All was progressing nicely for Tarquin, but trouble was brewing. The sons of Ancus had not forgotten how Tarquin denied them their birthright, and resolved to reclaim what they felt was theirs. Knowing they could never get close to the king, the brothers enticed 2 men to do their dirty work for them. The 2 men arrived at the palace and pretended to have a loud quarrel, eventually demanding the king settle their dispute. Tarquin came to see what all the commotion was about and agreed to settle the fight. But as he sat to adjudicate, one of the men pulled out an axe he had hidden in his robe and lodged it in the back of the king's head.
Jesus.
Tarquin fell, and the 2 men attempted to escape, but they were immediately captured. Tarquin's wife, Tanaquil, seeing the severity of the wound, immediately cleared the room and brought Servius Tullus in to help her tend to the king. Over the body, she told Servius that nothing could be done for Tarquin, but that it was imperative the men responsible for the crime should not sit on the throne. She implored Servius to take part in a charade to guarantee that neither of Ancus's sons would ever be king. Throwing open a window and addressing the crowd that had by this time gathered, Tanaquil told them that her husband's wound was only superficial and that the king would be back on his feet soon. In the meantime, she told them to obey Servius, who would act as king until Tarquin could resume his duties. At this point, of course, the king was already dead. Tarquin reigned
That bitch
37
died. That's a
years
skill
and
issue.
died in 579
Just so everybody
BC.
knows.
Servius performed the duties of king for a time as if he was merely acting in Tarquin's stead, going so far as to reserve judgment in some legal disputes, claiming that he must consult with the king. The sons of Ancus, believing their plot had failed and seeing Servius secure on the throne, went into exile. Not long after the transfer of power, Veii launched an attack on Rome, and Servius marched to meet them. Completely destroying the Viite army, Servius returned to Rome a beloved savior. At this point, clearly in command of the throne, the death
Weekend
of
at
Tarquin was
Tarquin's.
announced.
They literally
No one
weekend
questioned
at Tarquin's.
Servius's continued reign as king, and the plan hatched by Tanaquil was brought to a successful conclusion. Servius would be the second to last king of Rome, and by all accounts the last
Oh, you missed
good
your
one.
wife?
He was
Aw.
responsible for the final reconfiguration of Roman society prior to the establishment of the Republic, a reconfiguration that would have a profound effect on the way that Republic would ultimately be governed. Desiring to take
Long
stock
distance
of the city's
is hard.
resources, wealth, and population, he instituted the first census. Based upon the data he received, he divided landowning Romans, known as Assidui, into 5 classes. Nominally divided by wealth,
My
the
wife
idea
is
was to establish who could provide what when war inevitably came knocking. The first class was the richest, able to provide a helmet, round shield, bronze breastplate, leg armor, sword, and spear. The second class provided all the same equipment as the first, save for the breastplate. The third provided the same as the second, but for the leg armor. Only a spear and javelin were required of the fourth class, and the fifth provided merely slings and stones. Sandwiching these classes were the richest of the rich, already separately designated as equites, cavalrymen able to provide horses, and the poorest of the poor, i.e., most of the population, who were exempted from military service. Men aged 18
Fucking
to 40
base.
from the five classes formed the legions when the need, which was often, arose. The classes did not serve a strictly military function. They also formed the basis of the new Roman electoral college. The old tribal
Breast.
assembly created by Romulus, the Comita Curiata, was surpassed by Servius's new Comita Centuriata. Each of the classes were further divided into centuries, which
Oh,
voted
the
as
garlic
blocks.
that you used
The
on
centuries,
Oh,
however, were not equal in
no.
size. The first
Yeah,
class,
long
which was the
distance.
smallest, was divided into
I hope
80
you are
centuries.
able to be
The
together
second, third, and fourth
soon.
classes each had 20. The fifth, by far the largest, was composed of 30. The small group of equites were divided into 12 centuries, and the landless masses were granted just one.
Gotta keep pulling up
The
reference to
elections being
Cromie, the
determined by
slug
a simple
freak, the hot
majority,
slug freak.
equites in the first class held between them all the votes they needed to control
that
who would
little
hold
blurbo.
office and what policies would be pursued. There was some logic to the wildly skewed voting system. The wealthy shouldered the financial burdens of both state and military, and thus felt entirely justified in their stranglehold on power. The bulk of the population, however, would come to view the system as entirely unjust and would eventually have to take drastic steps for their voices to be heard.
Well, also based. but-
Servius's reign was progressing nicely. The Latin communities even contributed funds to build a temple to Diana in Rome, admitting once and for all that Rome was the capital of Latium. However, all was not well. Just as Ancus's sons were the undoing of Tarquin, so would the sons of Tarquin be the undoing of Servius. Servius believed he had covered this obvious threat by marrying his daughters to the two Tarquin boys, Lucius and Aruns. But this was not enough for Lucius, who felt he had been tricked out of his rightful succession, though his new wife was non-committal about this alleged injustice. His brother Aruns, who could not have cared one way or the other, found himself married to a woman, Tullia, who resented his lack of ambition and admired Lucius's drive.
Sorry.
Tullia further despised her own sister for not supporting an obviously great man in his quest for the throne. Evil took
Okay.
hold of them, not being particularly creative, they decided to simply kill their unwilling mates so they could be together and pursue the
Well,
crown
you know,
with full
maybe in
throttle.
that one case, Osric was
The
right.
newlyweds began a whisper campaign against Servius, pointing out his low birth and the fact that he had never been truly elected. To the richest in Rome,
Question,
they
are my
alleged
messages
that the
busted and not
census
coming
was no
through?
more
My
than a
internet be
trick to
bugging right
expose
now.
their wealth, so Servius could
empty
snatch
orange
it up
juice.
and hand it over to his lowborn friends. Lucius grew ever more bold.
Brain
as he gained
overheated.
support,
The last
until
thing I saw
finally
from
he
you is
decided to
brain
make his move.
overheated.
He went to the palace
Yo,
while
Mr.
Servius
Podcast
was
guy,
away
come back
and
up
sat
from the
upon
mic,
throne,
please.
demanding that the Senate assemble before him.
I'm actually
When
on
they
a,
did,
on a
out of
rigorous
mixture of
orange
fear and
juice
confusion,
silencing
He
campaign.
demanded they kneel before him and hail him King Tarquin. He was in the midst of a lengthy
You guys
speech
have to
degrading
hail me
Servius
King
when the old
Tarquin,
king
okay?
appeared, demanding an explanation. A scuffle ensued between the supporters of Tarquin and those loyal to Servius, and in the melee, the old king himself was struck and killed.
These kings
Servius
are
had reigned
suck at
43
staying
years
alive.
and died in
It's literally a
535
skill issue.
BC. Lucius would become known to history as Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, the last king of Rome.
None of these Roman
From the
names are
start, Tarquin was the very model of a tyrant. He was vain, arrogant, pompous, and dismissive of both the people and the Senate. He built monuments to himself at the expense of the rich, using the labor of the poor. Smart enough to understand his shaky position, having seized power without so much as a nod to electoral formalities, he chose fear as the basis
Well,
for his
have
reign.
you ever considered electoral
He claimed for
formalities are
himself all
cringe?
legislative and judicial functions and dared anyone to oppose him. Those who did quickly regretted their choice. Tarquin arrested, tried, and executed his opponents, completely bypassing the traditional court system. He confiscated property whenever he saw fit and arbitrarily reduced the ranks of the Senate, leaving it anemic and unable to counter his actions. Tarquin's misconduct was not confined to the city itself. He sought to consolidate Rome's power over Latium, and to this end called a council of the local nobility. He let them sit all day without making an appearance, until one of them rose to declare that Tarquin was making them wait on purpose to show that he could order them around at will. Just then Tarquin finally appeared. The king made note of the man who had spoken against him, and after the meeting broke up, bribed one of the noble slaves to plant a cache of weapons in his master's room. The deed done, Tarquin recalled the council and announced that he had just discovered a plot against his life and fingered the offensive noble as its
Oh,
leader.
right there on the Senate
They
floor.
marched as a group to where the noble was staying and discovered
Didn't
the
know it
hidden
was
weapons.
that kind of
That,
Roman story.
coupled with his speech from the day before, was enough to frame the poor man, and he was immediately executed.
You can't
without so
silence
much as
me.
a
I will
try.
reveal the truth.
The remaining Latin nobility, whether they believed the charges or not, believed that Tarquin was capable of almost anything, and so did nothing to challenge his position in
This
Rome.
guy's fucking crazy.
The city and surrounding countryside thus pacified, Tarquin sat back to enjoy the fruits of his labor. But only poison fruit can grow from such poisonous seeds, and Tarquin
Oh.
would soon pay the ultimate price for his
Ooh, the
underhanded
writer
tactics.
chops.
Tarquin, obviously, had engendered no goodwill in the city, and the population waited only for a spark to light them into full revolt. Tarquin's own son would provide that spark. The young man, Sextus, was invited to a dinner party
Sorry,
hosted by Collatinus,
what was his
a
name
local
again?
noble, and upon meeting Lucretia, the lady of the house, Sextus decided that he must have her. Inflamed with lust,
Holy shit,
he
she's
returned to
so
the house
hot, you
while
guys.
Collatinus was off laying siege to the nearby town of Ardea and raped her.
Oh!
His lust sated, Sextus rode off unaware of what he had set in motion. Collatinus, riding back to Rome
Damn,
with a
bitch.
certain Lucius Junius Brutus, was met by a messenger who bid him return
I
to
feel
his
like
house at
the
once.
History of Rome
There,
podcast is always going to
surrounded
have
by
a
her
sexual
father,
assault jump scare
Collatinus
just
and
around the corner.
Brutus, Lucretia told him what Sextus had done, and then, overwhelmed by shame,
Oh,
grabbed
no.
a knife and stabbed herself in the heart.
They always be killing
The three
themselves
men,
over.
grief-stricken, stood over her body and swore that the Tarquins would pay for her death.
Sure hope that
Returning
doesn't
at
have any
once to the
long-lasting
encamped army at
social
Ardea,
ramifications.
Brutus
on
raised
anything.
them into revolt with a stirring speech denouncing the Tarquins as oppressive criminals. He then led the army back to Rome, where he planned to expel the Tarquins once and for all. Arriving in the city, he
Like
marched
Lustlayer
through the street
Ultrakill?
and found a
Ultrakill
population
like the
slaving
Bible?
away on Tarquin's various pet projects and ready for revolution. Tarquin, at this point, having heard of the mutiny in Ardea, had ridden out to take control of the situation, but instead found his army gone and himself in exile from the city he allegedly ruled. Tarquinius Superbus reigned 24 years and would die seeking, but never regaining, the throne.
You die a little bitch.
Back in the
That's what you're
city,
telling me.
the liberated people declared the Tarquins enemies of the state and forever barred them from Rome. The Comita Centuriata was convened, and it was decided that kings should never again rule Rome, and that 2 men should be elected annually to be leaders, so that power could never again be concentrated in the hands of a single man.
Okay, kind of base.
Collatinus and Brutus were duly elected and were inaugurated as the first 2 consuls in Roman history. The year was 509 BC.
He
and
was
the
a
most famous
consul of
republic in the history of the
Rome.
world was born. The story of the ill-fated Tarquin dynasty casts an interesting shadow over Roman history. Through the obviously apocryphal royal biographies, a general outline of actual history begins to emerge. As I said in part 1, Roman culture was derived largely from Etruscan and Greek influences, so, as an instructive parallel, we are given the story of a family of kings who became masters of Rome after emigrating from Etruria and were descended from an exiled Greek. There, in the micro story of the Tarquins, is the macro story of all Rome. This dramatic, if fictitious account has roots in reality. Modern historians recognize the dominance Etruria had over Rome until the founding of the Republic. It is thought that Etruscan kings did indeed command Rome, and that they were rejected by a native population wary of their rule. Though the neatness of this account no doubt misses a reality filled with intermarriage and colliding cultures, making it hard to know who was a native
Intermarriage,
Roman
you say?
and who was a foreign Etruscan. The story of the kings also
What
offers
is
a moral
that
that the
emoji?
Romans followed to great success and abandoned at their peril.
Dead ass
Until
writing an
the
Ultrakill
ill-fated
fanfic right now. I
Tarquinius
can't lie to
Superbus,
you. Base,
none of
base,
the
base,
kings had
base,
been the
base,
son of
base,
a
base,
previous
base.
ruler. Hereditary succession played almost no part in the ascension of the kings. Ancus Marcius was the only one who was even related to one of his predecessors, and he was the grandson of Numa,
Well,
not
I
an
think we
immediate
also have some
heir.
time to get some color in.
This stands in stark contrast to the monarchies that emerged in the Middle Ages that were founded entirely on the passing of power from father
right,
to
so we
son,
got a
whatever the
wildfire
merits or
spirit
abilities of
here.
the child. Gibbon famously
What do you
marks
want
the
him
beginning
to
of the
look
end
like?
of the Roman Empire,
Something
with Marcus
preferably
Aurelius'
simple. I'm
sentimental
imagining,
choice of his son
something like
Commodus,
that
and not
sized.
another, more capable man to
But maybe it
succeed
has
the
like
Imperium in
a slight
177
animal
AD.
aspect.
The choice ended 5 successive transfers of power
What if this is
from
what
the
it looks
emperor
like?
to a man
What if
chosen
it's
on
a
merit,
fire
not
hedgehog?
relation. The 100-year period of the so-called 5 good emperors marked the height of Roman
That's
power,
the
wealth,
placeholder
and
until
stability. History
until
has
we have
shown
something
again
else.
and again that the ship of state is well sailed when leadership is based on great ability, and run against the rocks when it is based upon mere birth.
Oh, damn. His writer's chops
The
again.
Roman
He's
monarchy
flexing,
was now
bros.
dead, never to return. Next, we move on to the story of the Roman Republic and trace
wait,
its
he's got a
long march
tail,
through
too.
the Italian peninsula, across the Mediterranean, and into legend. Next week, we will discuss the first days of the Republic, who its initial leaders were, and what would happen to any man who ever again tried to make himself king of Rome.
I can do it. Easy. They just didn't try hard enough. Flaming armadillo. All hail, fire hedgehog. Maui head, made of coal, with flame coming out of it. Okay, that's pretty sick. He's my guy, guys. I don't think we're gonna get a flaming hedgehog this time, folks. It's okay. We got a vision. We got a vision here. Next episode. The public thing. That's a strange name for a podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the history of Rome.
I really like your guy.
It had been
if that's
200
him, the
years
guy up
since the
there.
founding of Rome, and since that time, the Romans had undergone a massive transformation. In the beginning, they were a collection of pastoral herdsmen and unsavory cast-offs, making their way in the world by flock and trade, and since that time, they had learned to become settled farmers, tilling the land and raising crops. They had gone from being a collection of armed rabble to a society of laws with a well-equipped, well-disciplined army. They had gone from upstart village to regional capital, and now stood ready to challenge a wider pool of neighbors for control of all Italy. The Etruscans lay to the north and the Greeks to the south, and having conquered the central lowlands during the reign of the kings, the Romans now turned to the hills and mountains of East Italy for fresh conquests, and, as always, were forced to parry the thrust of the Etruscan cities to the north.
Whoa.
This is the world into which the Republic was born. According to the legendary chronology, the kings were overthrown in 509 BC, though the date is highly suspect. Most likely later,
is a little
patriotic
sussy.
Roman historians changed the timing of the event to slightly predate the establishment of democracy in Athens by Cleisthenes in 508 BC. The Romans had a hard time believing they were not first and best in everything,
Guys, we were
especially in
so
the democracy
good.
they took so much pride in, so they altered their history to outdo the Greeks.
Jesus Christ.
However, without any concrete data, it is hard to know exactly when the kings were driven out, so we are forced to mark our own histories of the city with the 509 date. As I said in part 1, the sack of Rome by the Gauls in 389 BC destroyed all primary documentation.
Yeah, if you guys are
we
so
are
good,
left
why are you
with a
getting
mixture
sacked by a bunch of
legend and
barbarians?
historical fiction. Before we get
Idiot.
into the story of the early republic,
They're a bunch of
I want to
Frenchmen,
pause for a
dog.
moment and establish who exactly we are talking about here. I often say that Rome did this and that the Romans did that, but except for a few passing disambiguations, I have not done much to describe the varying nature of the population. Were they some homogeneous hive mind who agreed on everything and acted with a single will?
Yes.
No,
What?
quite the opposite.
What?
There were rich Romans and poor Romans
What?
and middle-class Romans. There were men and women and children. There were slaves and freed slaves and immigrants and criminals and honest men who worked hard every day and lazy men who did not. There were prostitutes and vestal virgins and intellectuals and illiterates. Just like any society, the city of Rome was inhabited by a vast array of individuals, each with their own worldview, motivation, and dream. And just like in any society, the Romans did not always get
I
along
would
with
not
one
be
another,
caught laughing
and,
by
in
Frenchmen.
fact, often fought bitterly with one another for control and freedom from control. When the Republic was founded, the population of Rome was around 130,000. This population was divided into two basic groups, the patricians and the plebes. Put simply, the patricians came from those families who could trace their roots back to the original 100 senators chosen by Romulus, and the plebes came from those that could not. Generally speaking, the distinction between patrician and plebe also followed economic class divisions, though, as we will see, it was never that simple. In the early days, the political weight of the classes was inversely
trying to,
related to their
like, have
numerical
him
size.
glowing on the inside
The
of his
smaller
mouth,
set of
but maybe
patricians
I'll
held
sort of
power
give
over the
up on
larger set of plebes. As I noted last week, the two richest classes in Rome held between them enough votes to snuff out any possible opposition, and those classes were, for the most part, made up of patricians, so the patricians made the rules. In the beginning, then, the Democratic Republic was really an oligarchy of wealthy, aristocratic families who shaped policy to serve their interests and who had no intention of ever letting anyone else into the decision-making process. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but let me just say that it did not take long for the plebes, especially those plebes who were wealthy, to demand a greater voice in government. This tension between the patricians and the plebes would dominate Roman politics for the duration of the empire. Outside the basic patrician-plebe dichotomy, there were those without even nominal political standing, namely women, slaves, and immigrants. These groups formed a majority in sheer numerical terms, but were denied
Plebes,
almost
just say
all
they were.
political rights.
Plebeians,
Even the plebeian
plebeians.
males, who howled righteously at the injustice of being denied a say in government, would have cried just as loud if someone had suggested suffrage being extended to women or slaves or
God, we
immigrants.
hate women.
The idea would have been beyond comprehension. And the contradictions of the early republic bear a striking resemblance to the contradictions of the early United States. When you picture the burgeoning Roman Republic, picture what you know of the burgeoning American Republic. The United States, though rhetorically cloaked in the language of freedom and equality, allowed only white, landowning males to vote. Eventually, the propertyless men agitated against the injustice of an oligarchical elite trampling on their freedoms and earned the same right, but women and blacks and Indians and the new immigrants were left out in the cold, present but unheard.
Slightly archaic.
This was Rome, a republic in which
But
the
alright.
disenfranchised majority were ruled by a disproportionately powerful elite.
Women in this
Then
economy.
was the basic political breakdown of the population. Economically speaking, whether patrician or plebe, the majority of Romans were, by this time, settled farmers. But this was no utopia of landowning citizen farmers. The land was owned by an elite minority and worked by the rest of the population.
For this kid.
Economics and politics coincided just as they do today, and the tension between owner and operator mirrored the tension between patrician
I'm
and
following
plebe.
them right now.
Plebes were constantly
Thank you.
agitating for land redistribution.
Also,
and
I think I
patricians
enabled
blocked
links.
reform whenever they could.
Possibly.
In this early stage of the empire, the actual work of the farms was
Oh
still
my
done by
God,
the lower
I
class
love this art.
citizens,
Holy crap.
slaves being an important part of the Roman economic model, but not yet the keystone upon which the entire system was based.
That
The
what a
farms
great
produced
art
two
style.
basic products: food for internal consumption, usually grain and cereals, and crops for external trade, usually olives and grapes, and the refined offspring.
Thank you for
of oil
breaking
and
your
wine.
silence.
The Romans, building on the roots
Ludic.
already established by the Etruscans, used savvy trade policies to enrich themselves with all manner
Worry.
of foreign goods, establishing
What's
a
it got?
truly international flavor in the city. But as in so many other aspects of Roman
We're
society,
talking how much we
it
hate
was the wealthy
women. Or, well,
patricians
the
who
Romans are
controlled
talking
the
about how much they hate
import-export boards,
women.
and it was they who benefited the most from foreign trade. Needless to say, the landless
Unfortunately, it's a
plebes
bunch
who
of
worked
women
in the
lovers in
fields
this,
did not
in
dress
this
in
chat,
African
as it should
finery
be, so,
and eat off of Greek silverware. Divisions were many within the population, economically and politically,
Yeah, it's
and
fine.
hatred abounded between the classes. But, in the end, they were all Romans, and set aside their differences any time the city was threatened, though picking up their rivalries right where they left off, when danger had passed.
Kind of based to be.
That all being said, it's time to continue with our story. And the tyranny of the monarchy had been banished forever. It was decided, and again, when you picture this,
Maybe we
feel
won't get
free to
color
picture the
in
patrician
quite. Well, maybe a
senators
little
and
bit of color.
equites hammering out the details, because it was really them making all the early decisions. The lower classes and plebes had nothing to do with it. The two men should rule annually to avoid any single man accumulating too much power. Originally, these men were called praetors, though the title would be changed in the early 300s BC to the more familiar consul. For clarity's sake, I will use the latter designation even for the early executives who were technically praetors, because the office itself did not change, just the name, and, well, most translations of early Roman history refer to them as consuls anyway, so there is no reason to confuse an already confusing situation with a lot of semantic nitpicking. Anyway, to the Roman mind, ensuring freedom was not so much a matter of scaling back or limiting the power of the executive, as the Founding Fathers sought to do with their system of checks and balances, as it was a matter of limiting the length of time within which absolute rule could be wielded. The consuls had all the same powers a
Leon
king
voice,
had,
women.
near absolute power over war and peace, life and death.
He said based, he said
They
the
just
thing.
had to give it up after a year. The second consul was the
You're
one
gay
check
because
the
you
Romans
love
did
men.
add
I'm
into the
gay because
system.
I hate women.
One
We are
consul
not
could
the same.
veto the actions of the other,
So
and that
true.
was that. Any consul who tried to run away with power could be stopped at a word from his colleague. If the two conspired to oppress the people, their terms of office expired after a year, and they were back to being mere citizens, with all the legal weight that would be brought down upon two men who sought to make themselves king. In the end, it was the expiring term of office that really let the Romans sleep well at night. The executive power sharing was merely a useful novelty. In that year, 509 BC, this was as far as the Republic had gone constitutionally. Rather than the Comitia Centuriata getting together and electing a king who served for life, they got together and elected 2 men who served for 1 year. As I said last week, the first 2 consuls were Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. The former led the revolt against the king, and the latter's raped wife had sparked the event. Brutus's first act was to make all men swear an oath that they should never again allow a king to rule Rome. As you can see, the legacy of Numa remained a potent force. Brutus felt that a sacred oath before Jupiter would be enough to bind men to oppose monarchy, and, barring a few exceptions, it did. The Romans did not mess around with their oaths. There was, however, an immediate problem. Collatinus, you will note, bore the hated moniker Tarquinius, being a relative of the overthrown king. The population, jittery in their newfound freedom, worried that lust for power was an inborn trait of the Tarquins, and immediately regretted their election of Collatinus, despite the fact that he had helped lead the revolution and vocally denounced his cousins. When pressed, though, Collatinus agreed, for the sake of the stability and viability of the new republic, to resign the consulship, even though everyone agreed it was completely ridiculous to ask him to do so. In his place, another one of the ringleaders of
Power
the
Washing
revolt
Sim
was
4K
elected,
DLC.
Publius Valerius, who will, in a moment, earn the honorarium
Lust?
Publicola,
Like the
or
Lust
friend of
Slayer?
the
Like
people,
Ultra Kill?
for his
Sorry,
service to
demons.
Rome. Students of American history will immediately
just got
recognize
House Flipper,
Publius's name. The Federalist Papers, written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John
Haven't
Jay,
gotten into
in
Power
defense of the
Wash
newly written
Simulator.
Constitution,
Possibly never will.
appeared in print
Sounds
under the
demonic, to be
pseudonym
honest, but-
Publius in honor of this consul's role in securing Rome's new republic. Publius is often cited as being one of the original consuls of Rome, but we should not forget Collatinus and his selfless resignation in the face of baseless and superficial fears for the sake of his country's freedom.
Oh, it's fine.
The first threat the new republic faced was the first threat all successful revolutions face, namely, counter-revolution. There were more than a few Romans who had lived just fine under the kings, and were in no mood to lose their privileged place in society. A collection of young nobles, including 2 sons of the consul Brutus, conspired with envoys of the exiled King Tarquin to betray the city to him and reinstate the monarchy. The plot was revealed
of
by one of
fucking
the noble's
losers.
slaves, and the entire group was arrested. Brutus was shocked to see his own sons involved in the affair.
I love this
but
that all these
incontrovertible
like
evidence
slaves
was
are the
produced
ones who are
confirming
like
their
ratting
guilt.
out these
The penalty
these
for treason was
counter-revolutions
severe,
and all these
and
shitty
despite
people.
his
It's
tortured
extremely funny.
misgivings, Brutus would not stop the sentence
winning.
from being carried out. The young conspirators were tied to a post, scourged, and then beheaded. Brutus's decision was long lauded by the Romans as a patriotic sacrifice, teaching a moral lesson about putting the welfare of the state before even one's own family. But the ruthlessness of the decision often makes it difficult for us to see the nobility of the act. The second threat the new republic
Simply spank
faced
your
was the
children.
second threat all successful revolutions face, namely, invasion by an opportunistic enemy trying to take advantage of a neophyte central government.
Me when I'm
Tarquin had by this time taken refuge in Veii and pleaded with the nobility there to aid him in reconquering Rome. He argued that the virus of republicanism might infect Etruria and wipe out all the royal families.
Oh
in
my god, the
region.
woke mind virus.
The nobles of Veii were indeed worried about their subjects catching the freedom bug and, believing that Rome's leadership would be shaky and disjointed without a strong king in charge, agreed to aid Tarquin and attacked. However, to the surprise and consternation of Tarquin and the Vieites, Brutus and Publius proved to be extremely capable commanders, routing the army from Veii easily.
Damn it.
The battle was not without tragedy for the Romans, though. In the middle of the fight, Brutus, liberator of Rome, was killed. His body was borne back to the city, and Rome went into mourning for a full year. Publius now stood alone, and, like Collatinus before him, soon fell under suspicion by the fickle and paranoid masses. After the battle with the Vieites, Publius began construction on a home atop the Velia, a ridge jutting from the north side of the Palatine Hill. The people suspected him of making a fortress from which he could safely enslave them all. Publius caught wind of the sentiment and called a mass meeting, shaming the populace for their irrational fears, and
You
announcing
guys,
that
don't
if
be
it
so
worried them
mean to
so
me.
much, he would move his home to the bottom of the hill, where they could all keep watch on him. He further used the opportunity provided by the meeting to propose 2 new laws, which made him a hero to the now assuaged masses and earned him the aforementioned title Publicola. The 2 laws are famous even to this day. The first stated that any man who tried to make himself king could be killed at any time by any other man without fear of reprisal. And the second stated that any decision by the magistrate
Oh my god, it's
could
the
be
it's
appealed
the
to the People's
old version of the
Assembly.
stand your ground law.
Publius, content with the single credit he received for these democratic initiatives, then called for an election to fill the open consulship. Marcus Horatius Pulvius was eventually elected after a short detour through a consul who was elected but then died from old age a few days later. And this closed the first year of the Republic. Leadership settled, the people mollified, and Rome secure. In the coming years, the tension between patrician and plebe would dominate public life in Rome, the patricians wary always of runaway mob rule, and the plebes seeing no practical difference between the overthrown king and the newly empowered Senate. Next week, we will jump headlong into this so-called conflict of the orders and witness the plebes voting with their feet and demanding a real voice in the allegedly democratic republic they had all fought so hard to establish and keep.
We don't have to argue with kings. We can just kill them. You've had to put blank squares in the PDF until then. Oh, you have a PDF now? Right, you told me about the PDF last week. Magnificent. The wokeism. Kind of makes me want to strangle them, I'm not going to lie. We got a politician up here named Pierre Poilievre. And he's doing the whole fucking playbook with tons of fucking dog whistles. Woke this, woke that. Why didn't you wake up on the other side of the fucking bed, you stupid piece of shit? Ungrump yourself, God. Anyway. Don't get me started on PP. Oh God, Miss Ebola. Thank God you're here. Miss Ebola, you missed me complaining about the kids I'm studying lifeguarding with. It was the usual complaints. Oh, they don't study. They're not as much of a teacher's pet as I am. They don't know what a stroke is, despite doing standard first aid. It's, I don't think those kids are going to make it. Alrighty, I think we might wrap this up. Okay, I'm going to give a couple lines to this wildfire spirit to kind of make him look a little bit more in line with his pal here. I mean, he's like an emissive layer, so having line art maybe isn't really what he needs, but he'll change his face configuration a bit too. I know you said Maori head, but I really cannot unskull myself with this apparently. Nerd glasses. The skeleton appears. The only stroke they know is the one-handed version. Extremely true. We were practicing spinals again, and I guess one of the kids didn't get the fucking memo and started like dragging this guy out of the pool like brute force, which was pretty fun. One tried to phone 911 over simulated again, over a asthma attack, a minor asthma attack, a minor and medicated asthma attack. What else? A lot of silly things happen at the lifeguard class. I really love it. I'm having fun. And I have plenty more classes that I'm going to do after this. I'm probably going to do They offer like for $500. Wow, what a deal. You can do lifeguard instructor training, first aid instructor training, and swim instructor training. And that would up my hire ability and my wages by quite a bit. But a lot of places seem to really prefer that you have the additional instructor training, which makes sense, but I'm also like, oh God, can I like apply and get a discount and train later? I don't think I'm gonna have enough time in March to get that training before I move to Ottawa in April. But that's okay, because I could just do it in Ottawa. Even I'm a fucked up little guy. Okay. Last couple lines, then we're going to move on to the second one. And then we're going to get History of Rome back on here. Art. You know, the best way to treat asthma attacks is just repeating "just breathe, idiot" over and over. Based? I mean, that's basically what, our treatment says. Just do your pencil breathing. Okay, I totally overworked the fire spirit, but you know what? That's how it works out. That's how sometimes life is overworking a fire spirit. Let's get a little bit of a shadow on here. All right. Maybe I'll un-overwork that fire spirit later, but wait. I know how to unify this. Everybody shut up. Everybody be fucking quiet. I'm gonna add a little reflection. Sorry I yelled at you just then. I'm very passionate about integrating elements. That works. There we go. Alrighty. Thank you very much for the commission. I'll send this along after the stream. Cute little tiefling twink. Can't wait for the illustrations. Gonna tie the entire PDF together. We're gonna get those illustrations, worry. So when are you gonna draw Gianni as a slime girl? Oh my god, I forgot about that project. Yeah, it'll be in time for D&D. Excellent. I am starving. Oh my god. Ooh, man. Such a good one. Miss Ebola, being my agent, I should hire you. Listen, maybe at the end of the stream we'll have time to sneak in a Gianni slime girl. Green Alien 1. I love Green Alien. All right, this one's for my good friend Zane, who is looking for a Appalachian barbarian. Got a cool pose here. I deviated a little bit from his requested pose, but not too much. I'm sure he won't be pissed, unless he is. But let's... Yeehaw. What? Worry hungers for it. Hungers for visualization. Well, don't worry. Soon. Asterisk. Soon. This is for Gianni Slap. I gotta do it. We will go. Okay. We will get a Gianni slime girl. And we'll do it today. Although we'll do it after 5. Alchemy systems with symbols that have meaning. How do I want to render this one? Guess I'll do a little bit of shading. All right, let's get the history of Rome up here. Next episode. Trials and tribunalations. Very funny. Oh shit, this is 2008. I think we should all be glad for the quality of the sound, given that this is 2008
Hello,
tech.
and welcome to the History of Rome. Last week, we discussed the transitional year of 509 BC, when Rome went from being a typical Italian kingdom to an atypical Italian republic. Though the actual workings of the republic were not as democratic as they appeared on the surface, the fact remained that the monarchy had been abolished and annual elections now determined leadership. The first years after the change would prove difficult for the new government, for it faced both internal dissension and external invasion. Those years would see the final defeat of the Tarquins, the resubduing of Latium, and finally the extension of political rights to the plebes with the creation of the office of tribune, the plebeian answer to the patrician consulship. After his V8 army was
When I need a
defeated, the
patrician
ex-king
answer to a
Tarquin next
consulship.
took refuge in the Etruscan city of Clusium under the protection of its king, Lars Porsena. Tarquin begged Porsena to attack the Romans, repeating his line about the threat democracy posed to royalty everywhere and the necessity of returning a king to the throne. Porsena, like the V8s, no doubt took this argument under advisement, but when he agreed to make war with the Romans, he did so ultimately for his own reasons. There are two accounts
Who
of what
wouldn't want to
happened
fight
next.
those fucking Italians?
Either Porsena invaded and was successfully repulsed, or he invaded and captured the city. The former is alleged by Roman folktales, the latter is supported by modern historical analysis. According to the legendary tradition, Porsena, in defense of his
Do
fellow
you have any
Etruscan
idea how
king
hard it is to
Tarquin,
make a symbol in the
marched
style of
south
an
and was
alchemy
met
symbol
by the
that
Roman
felt like a
forces at the
fish?
Tiber.
The answer is
The
very.
Romans, seeing the size of the Etruscan army, fled back
You
across
gotta
the
remember
river,
that password, that
leaving
way
the
I can make a
bridge,
true
and
slime
therefore
girl.
the city unguarded.
You mean a cock sleeve? I
A
mean,
single
what?
Roman soldier named Horatius, realizing he could not prevent the army's flight, ordered men to set fire to the bridge in order to prevent the Etruscans from crossing and sacking the city. To buy time, he stood alone on the far side of the bridge and challenged the whole of Porsena's army to combat.
That's not such a big
While
deal.
the
I can do
dumbstruck
that.
Etruscans tried to figure out what they should do with this crazy brave, but clearly suicidal soldier, the other Romans set fire to the wooden bridge.
No!
The Etruscans were finally snapped out of their stupor when the burning bridge collapsed into the river and attacked, but Horatius jumped in the river and swam unscathed to the other side, saving the city and enrolling himself in the pantheon of great Roman heroes.
I could do that.
Porsena was forced to initiate a siege, which proved no more effective than his initial assault, again due to the bravery of a single Roman citizen. This time it was Mucius Scaevola, who proved his valor and secured ultimate victory for Rome. The city was suffering under Porsena's siege
Sack.
and showed no signs of being able to fight it off. Mucius, taking matters into his own hand, crossed over to the Etruscan camp. He
Penis
made his
pouch.
way to Porsena's headquarters
Mucus
and
maze.
waited for an opportunity to strike.
Mucus
When
maze
Porsena's
was
entourage
really
emerged,
good,
Mucius attempted
also
to assassinate
really
the king,
unfortunate.
but, unsure of who his target was, mistakenly attacked one of the king's secretaries.
like, hey boy, do you want to
Mucius
check
was
out my...
seized and dragged before the shaken king. What happened next would be the stuff of Roman legend and a moral story to inspire generation upon generation of future citizens. Mucius told the king that the Romans had declared war not on the men of Clusium, but upon Porsena personally, and that he was merely the first in a long line of assassins who would not stop until the king was dead. The king, unnerved by this idea, ordered Mucius burned alive and found himself
know,
only
folks, I think
further
this is gonna be a
unnerved
banger.
by what Mucius did next. The Roman stuck his right hand into the fire and, without flinching, allowed it to burn.
I could do that.
He declared that such was the regard Roman men held for their bodies, and that the king should remember what lay in store for him.
Guys, they're so
Porsena
cool.
was, to say the least, impressed and very freaked out. He allowed Mucius to go
This
free,
guy's fucked
commending
up.
the man for his bravery, and not wishing to live his life under a death sentence from a bunch of psychotic patriot assassins, he made peace with Rome and lifted the siege, never having taken the city. This was the official legend. Other, non-Roman sources tell a different, more plausible story. In this version, Porsena did indeed take Rome in the turbulent years after the founding of the Republic and set up a puppet government. The outcome seems reasonable in that the Etruscans of Clusium would have been much stronger and far better equipped than the Romans were at
I
this
eat
point,
baked potato.
and resistance would have been futile at
Bug-like,
best.
machine-like, mammal,
The reason
eldritch.
Porsena, who is a confirmed historical figure, invaded
Banger,
Rome is a
banger,
further
banger.
divide between fact and legend. The melodrama of Tarquin's plea for Etruscan solidarity is pure fiction, as is the decisiveness of individual Roman bravery.
Pure fiction.
Population upheaval in Italy around 500 BC had resulted in an estrangement between Etruria and their Greek trading partners in the south. Specifically, Etruscan trade routes were disrupted by the Volscians, a central Italian hill tribe who settled the plains between Etruria and Magna Graecia south of Rome.
Pull up a storm.
Porsena's conquest of the Romans was just a step in the greater project of maintaining the safety of the southern trade roads from attack. Disabusing the notion that the war had been waged on Tarquin's behalf, Porsenna left his son in charge of matters in Latium after defeating Rome.
Latium.
His son,
That's where
though,
they
was
keep all the
defeated by an
lads.
army of allied Latins and driven back north, re-securing independence for Rome as an unintended byproduct.
You're going to
The Latin
fucking
communities
trace
emerged strong
this
from the
so
encounter, and Rome
bad.
humbled, setting
It's
up
a
a
very
major
small storm legend
confrontation
also.
for control of central Italy that would ultimately see Rome re-emerge as the dominant force in Latium for another 150 years.
Oh yeah, I love Tracy.
The Latins had chafed under Roman rule during the reign of the Tarquins, and took the opportunity presented by Rome's weakened position to attempt a redrawing of the political landscape. Disorganized by Porsena's invasion and a lack of internal political unity, Rome seemed easy pickings for the emboldened Latins. But they underestimated Rome's will, a common mistake made by enemies of the empire for years to come. An alliance of Latin communities broke from the Romans and forced the issue into an armed conflict, which they thought would see them master Rome, but instead it led them right back under the yoke. A decisive battle was fought near Lake Regillus, southeast of Rome, and though the details of the fight are unimportant, the Battle of Lake Regillus is important for two reasons. First, as I mentioned, it ended Latin resistance to Rome for another 150 years, until, embroiled in a long war with the Samnites, Rome was again seen as vulnerable enough to resist. Second, it marked the first time that a dictator
Rome was like an
led a
IRL
Roman
soap
army
opera,
in battle.
yeah.
The office of
Good for
dictator was
fantasy
a
world
curious
building,
instrument
yeah.
to find within the constitution of a republic.
I mean, like,
but the Romans felt that extraordinary
I could spot
emergencies called for
George
extraordinary
Lucas's
solutions,
Roman influences.
and dictators
when,
were appointed periodically over the years when such emergencies arose.
Fucking
Basically,
episodes
a
1 and
dictator
2
was appointed when all the red tape
came
needed to
out
be
because
cut
it
through,
kind of
and one
coincided
single
with the
man
history
needed
of
to
like
take
learning the
decisive
history of
action
Roman school,
now,
and I'm like, wait,
without
that's just
complaint or appeal or challenge.
Caesar.
According to law,
That's just
a
how
dictator
Caesar
could be
gained
appointed
control.
for one
The whole
6-month
Palpatine
term,
thing.
at the end of which he would resign,
then,
and
like,
power would
Tarquin,
revert back to the consuls.
Wasn't he like one of the?
At the beginning of his
the
term, the
fucking
dictator
old
appointed
man,
a
the hot
vice
old man?
dictator called his master
The
of
originals.
horse, who was accountable to no one but the dictator himself.
Maybe it's Tarkin, but close
The
enough.
Romans were sufficiently distressed by the hostility of the Latins that they used their extraordinary solution for the first time to lead an army against a foreign threat. And technically the first dictator ever appointed had been a man named Titus Lartius, who had served briefly in that position 2 years before to quell internal riots, but beyond trivia, the event is hardly worth
Italians are
mentioning.
always dramatic. Oh, so true.
The appointment of Aulus Postumius, however, was a watershed moment. Lartius's appointment had been a ploy used by the patricians to put the fear of God back into the plebes, which of course it did, but there was never any question of actually instilling him with dictatorial powers for any period of time. Postumius, however, was given the keys to the city and told to do whatever was necessary to defeat the Latins, essentially that he was now a law unto himself. Postumius did indeed lead the army to victory over the Latins, and then, in a remarkable display of constitutional loyalty, stepped down from the heady heights of absolute dictatorship and restored the consuls to their rightful positions.
Damn.
The remarkable giving up of power demonstrates both Postumius's personal honor and the extent to which Rome as a whole probably would have cried out for his murder if he had considered remaining in power. The monarchy really was dead, and though dictators would be appointed off and on for the next 450 years, it was not until Julius Caesar that a dictator did not ultimately resign of his own free will. The Latins reconquered and the dictatorship passed, Rome found itself at peace. And as a general
He
rule,
was like
whenever
the
Rome
hot
found itself
dictator,
at peace
everybody,
abroad,
okay?
it immediately found itself divided at home. The question of plebeian rights, never satisfactorily settled, now reared its head once again.
Caesar really do be
The
like,
plebes
I
were
love
not to be put
democracy.
off this time. No amount of patrician chicanery and backroom dealing would
Julius
break their
Caesar would. Oh
solidarity.
yeah, especially in the
Only
Rome
rights guaranteed
iteration.
by
Where's
law
the
would
hot old
satisfy
man
them
from?
now. The plebes
Terror.
would ultimately win political concessions from the
not
patricians,
Cillian.
though
No,
it took
that'd
the
actually
first
be- no,
recorded
it's-
strike in history to do
It's like an
so.
equally kind of Celtic name.
Trouble arose over the matter of debt bonding. In Roman law at the time, if a debtor could not pay his creditor, then he became a bonded servant to the creditor until the debt was repaid. This system of indentured servitude essentially made permanent slaves of the debtors because, while servants to the creditors, they
I'm
were
gonna
unable
butcher
to
his
earn
name.
any money to pay off their debts. Many of the
Ciaran
soldiers who
Hinds.
fought in the recent war against the
Ciaran
Latins
Hinds.
found themselves bonded in this way.
Yeah, he's
The
fucking
practice
cute
in
as
this
fuck.
case was especially egregious because the debts were
We got the
incurred while
whole
the men
box
were off
set
fighting
of
in patriotic
Rome.
defense of the city.
Finally introduced Gianni
The
to it. And
plebes
he
agitated for debt relief,
loves
but were
it.
rebuffed by the patricians.
The
whose
actor who played
attitude
Titus
was
Polo just
basically,
recently passed
you
away,
take on
actually.
the debt, you pay the price. Offended
Very
by
sad.
this high-handed treatment, the plebes were on the verge of full-blown revolt.
Twirling
when
my
the
hair and
city
shit.
suddenly found itself
I'd
under
sacrifice
attack
my
from all sides.
democracy for him.
The Sabines,
Would.
Volscians, and Aquians all began making forays into Roman territory, and the Senate called for armies to be raised. The plebes sensed an opportunity, and when the consuls began calling names for enlistment, not one of them made a move. The Senate was basically beside itself at this mass act of treason and immediately appointed a dictator to smash the resistance. But in an amazing display of moderation and wisdom, they appointed the brother of Publius Publicola, Manlius Valerius, whom the plebes loved, to the office.
Manlius Valerius?
Valerius begged the plebes to do
Shut
their duty
up.
and enlist, promising that once hostilities were concluded, the issue of debt relief would be addressed straight away. Swayed by Valerius, they relented and legions were formed. In due course, all 3 foreign threats were put down, and the legions returned to Rome. Back in the city, however, Valerius was unable to fulfill his promise. The patrician senators blocked his attempts at debt relief, and Valerius resigned his office, laying at the Senate's feet all domestic turmoil that would ensue as a result of their decision. The disbanded legionnaires were outraged at the betrayal and took an extraordinary step that would become known to history as the secession of the plebes. The soldiers marched en masse to the Sacred Mount, a hill 3 miles from Rome, and set up a fortified camp, refusing to return to the city until their demands were met. The population of the city flew into a panic. The remaining plebes feared retaliatory violence from the patricians, and conversely, the patricians feared runaway mob violence without the army around to maintain order.
As they should.
And what they both feared the most was external invasion. If word got out that Rome's army had abandoned her, every 2-bit tribe in the neighborhood would come knocking on the city gates, and Rome would be at their mercy. So the Senate relented and sent an envoy to the plebe camp to broker a deal. The settlement did not address the debt question directly. Rather, a new office was created to shield the plebes from future patrician tyranny, the tribunate. The dangerous precedent set by the strike was pointed out to the plebes by the patrician envoy, who compared the republic to a body.
You
It is true, he
guys,
told
you
them,
have
the
to
hands and
relent,
feet
okay?
and mouth could join forces and stop working for the lazy stomach, who sat there greedily receiving all the food the other parts worked for. But
Don't
if they
tell
were to
me
do
you
so,
would
the entire
stop
body would
saying
simply die of
democracy.
starvation, for the stomach pumped energy back out into the limbs. The plebes would be granted more rights to end the secession, the envoy said, but they must not think, in the future, that starving the stomach was in their enlightened best interest.
Oh, my
The
stomach.
plebes took some note of this, but were so absorbed with their success.
I am a
that
Gianni
it was
chatter, I will
doubtful
say
the
unhinged
lesson
shit.
fully
You know
sank
what?
in.
It is wrong for us to request that
The
you
role
don't.
of
You're
tribune
right.
was defensive in nature. 2
messed up.
plebeian men would be elected each year to act as a counterweight to the consuls. Initially, the power of the tribunes was modestly held to the right to free any man from patrician imprisonment, though in the future they would gain the right to veto, literally, I forbid, any law passed by the consuls or the Senate at a word. The tribunes were also granted sacrosanctity, or the right to be free from harm. The plebes took a solemn oath to kill any man who attempted to assault a tribune, and more than once that oath was fulfilled. The tribunate would become a flashpoint for Roman politics for the remainder of the Republic. The eventual power to veto led to a number of showdowns with the patricians, both sides bloodying themselves in their attempts to control state policy. The power of the office would peak with the Gracchi brothers around 125 BC and fall into obsolescence with the ascension of the Caesars. But for the bulk of the Republican period, it was an important and powerful office. The tribunes would be elected by a new assembly called the Comitia Tributa, which would be made up of the now 35 tribes of Rome. Suffrage in the assembly was not based on a property assessment, as it was with the Centuriata, and so the Comitia Tributa was as democratic a form as Rome would ever see. The secession of the plebes occurred in 494 BC, about 15 years after the birth of the Republic. Though domestic combustion and foreign invasion were constant threats, the Republic had passed through its infancy and emerged as an adolescent power ready for fresh challenges. Any threat posed by the ex-king Tarquin was gone, and monarchy was now firmly in the rearview mirror. The attempted revolt by the Latin communities had been suppressed by a Republican army, and Rome managed to maintain control of Latium just as it had while a monarchy. The patricians and plebes were settled in an alliance, uneasy though it may have been, and the population was more or less at peace with itself. Next week we will cover the creation of the final piece of the Republican puzzle, the Law of the 12 Tables, as well as discuss the rising threat posed by the Volscians, which caused the Romans to make their first concerted forays into the eastern hills, where they would fight the wars that would ultimately win them control.
Yeah, hilarious how I'm afraid of saying anything too goofy, but then I remember Gianni's chat. Listen, we're all Gianni chatters here, especially me. Well, maybe not especially me. There's some truly unhinged shit in Gianni's chat. Keep it up. I prefer a challenge. Me when I yee my haw. Maybe the real Gianni chat was the friends we made along the way. You know what? I have to use the restroom real quick. I gotta go piss girl. I will leave you with the podcast and with yow. Whoop, we're okay. Whoa. Fight me for 12 rounds? I could do 6, maybe. I could hold my ground for 6. After 6, you're gonna pull one of those. I know you. You're gonna pull one of those fucking Mortal Kombat moves. You're gonna rip my fucking spine out along with my skull, and then you're gonna show everybody my sexy spine without even charging money for it. If you want to see my sexy spine, you gotta pay me. Go to onlyspines.com. This one's called The Roman Washington. You guys, the United States is just like Rome. I know you don't understand Roman history unless we put it through the lens of American history. But also, like, that's kind of valid. All right, be right back.
Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. We ended last week in 451 BC with the 12 Tables of Law written down and the decemvirate expelled. This week I want to step back a few years to focus on the life of one man, Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus, who was passed into the collective memory as a paradigm of Republican virtue, even though the decisive moments of his life were almost certainly invented by later historians to embellish his famous career, and, in the end, nothing he did was particularly unprecedented. Still, his biography continues to resonate, and taken by itself, it is a pretty good story of a humble man who had absolute power thrust upon him, and then, remarkably, relinquished that power and returned to his plow. A man who sacrificed everything for the Republic. Cincinnatus was born around 519 BC, when the king still reigned, and was just a boy when Brutus and Collatinus expelled the Tarquins. He was therefore one of the first citizens of Rome who lived his entire life under a Republican government, without strong memories of
6
the
rounds
monarchy.
work. How much?
He was in the vanguard of a critical generation. His elders remembered vividly the tyranny of Tarquin, and their steadfast Republican principles reflect
Family Guy
a
money
personally
moments of
developed
Subway
hatred of
Surfing.
monarchy.
Maybe some Jingle
They were the
Keys.
victims and would do anything to avoid being
Oh, I'm
victims
sorry.
again.
Dinner
Cincinnatus, however, and those of his
tomorrow?
generation never personally experienced this victimization. Once they came of age, the Republic would have to sink or swim on its own merit. If a would-be tyrant began to acquire too much power, there would be no one to turn to and say, "Hey, remember Tarquin?"
How do we
This
inject a
guy's
little
trying
bit more
to be another
fantasy
Tarquin,"
into this outfit?
because there would be no one left who actually remembered Tarquin.
He's like
It is in this
Appalachian.
passing from living memory that
Canonically
mistakes of
Appalachian,
history repeat themselves. Ambitious men of later generations might attempt to seize power, and, believing their times to be unique, a cowering population might allow it. In those times, only vigilance born of a love of republic, not a hatred of monarchy, would save the people from slavery, and Cincinnatus was amongst the first to set down that love of the republic for its own sake.
Yeah,
To
guys,
dispel
hating
one myth
slavery is
straight
not
away,
enough. You
Cincinnatus
also have
was
to
at no
really,
point a
really, really
defender
love
of
your
the little
country.
guy.
Yeah, right.
He was a patrician by birth and upbringing.
Does that sound
and
about
when
right?
he
I
emerged
guess
from the
it
public
does.
stage, it was as a steadfast opponent of the tribunes and their reforms. His first appearance in the historical record is not a starring role, but rather a supporting part in the drama of his son, Queso.
Piss run.
There
That
was
was
a great
quick.
deal
Piss
of
run,
civil
yeah.
unrest in the aftermath of Tarantillus's proposal to
I don't take
codify the law,
inconsiderately
and
long
plebe
bathroom
demonstrations in the
breaks.
forum were often broken
Mostly
up by
because I need
collections
to
or
have
gangs, if you
constant
prefer,
stimulation.
of young patrician nobles.
That phones cannot.
Queso, an abnormally large young man, took to this with great relish, personally beating and chasing any plebe who tried to take part in such
Slake.
demonstrations. Young and hot-tempered that he was, though, he was easy pickings for a savvy tribune named
Shit, I
Virginius,
hate slavery,
who
but I also
intentionally
hate my
goaded
country.
Queso
Sorry,
by leading
guys.
provocative public marches that would inevitably draw the wrath of the young man.
Well, I guess it's not
Once
getting
he had enough
abolished in Rome
witnesses and
today,
evidence,
pal.
Virginius brought capital charges against Queso for, well, all the horrible things he had done. Queso was ordered to appear at a trial, and if he did not, then he would be fined a large sum of money. It is at this point that Cincinnatus makes his first appearance in the public record, defending his son against Virginius's accusations and asking that the charges be dropped. Rather than face an obviously hostile and biased court, Queso fled north to Etruria and out of the history of Rome completely.
I know how we make him a little bit more
His son
fantasy.
having
We give him
essentially
bracers.
jumped bail, Cincinnatus was forced to sell most of his properties to pay the debt, leaving him a pauper with only a small plot of land on the far side of the Tiber. It is from this impoverished state that Cincinnatus' own legend begins.
Cincinnatus.
In 460 BC, not long after the Sabines had been expelled from the citadel, Cincinnatus was chosen to serve
Like
as
I
one of the two
know,
consuls
I know,
for that
American
year.
cities are named after
The
a
tribunes
lot
were
of
less than
Roman
thrilled at
Greek
this
Greek
development,
shit, but
recognizing
come
that
on.
they had just put the screws to this old man because they were angry with his son, and now he was in a position of authority over them. Cincinnatus did nothing to ease their minds, immediately attacking the character of the plebe leadership, who he accused of aiding
Home
and
of
abetting
challenge
the Sabine
pissing.
capture of the
I win
citadel
every
with
time.
their selfish myopia. This set the tone
We got
for
into
the
a
year.
challenge piss run, yeah.
Struggles
How
ensued
are my
between
numbers,
the
Miss Ebola?
consuls
Pretty
on the
good?
one hand, the tribunes on the other, with the Senate and popular assemblies caught in between. Cincinnatus managed to kill Tarantillus's bill for the year, while the tribunes banned the consuls
I was
from
like,
taking any
Tarantino
army more than 1 mile outside the city limits. By the end of the year, no compromise was reached, and the battle was set to continue on into the next year, but the Senate passed a law stating that no magistrate, patrician or plebe, could serve in successive years. The tribunes dismissed this out of hat and had themselves re-elected, so the patricians were set to reconfirm Cincinnatus when he announced that if they were to act no better than the plebes, then they were no better than the plebes, and refused to stand for office.
They were stinky.
Agreeing reluctantly to this logic, the patricians allowed Cincinnatus to retire to his small farm. It would not be long, however, before he was called back to service in his most famous role, dictator of Rome. In 458, the Aequians had been causing Rome trouble, and one of the consuls for the year was sent with an army to deal with them. However, the fight was much rougher than it had been in the past, and the legions found themselves pinned down, unable to retreat, and facing annihilation. The citizens of Rome panicked, and, without dissent, a dictator was called for, and Cincinnatus was named. A delegation was sent to inform the old man, and famously found him at work on the small farm he had retired to, a living paradigm of Roman virtue. The delegation saluted Cincinnatus as dictator, imploring him to return to the city at once. The tribunes were appalled to see their old political enemy return to such a powerful position, but Cincinnatus was greeted in the city with such acclaim that there was little they could do but hope that the old patrician would not turn his absolute power against them. Cincinnatus, however, was not out to settle political grudges, well, not yet anyway, and promptly raised an army and marched to the rescue of the besieged legion. Wasting no time, Cincinnatus' army swept in and decisively beat the Aequians, saving the legion and ending the threat. He marched back to Rome and celebrated his well-earned triumph a mere 15 days after being named dictator.
Damn, bitch.
Before stepping down, though, Cincinnatus did clear up one bit of family business, forcing Virginius to plead guilty to perjury and go into exile. Rome safe and his family's honor
Virginius?
restored,
Okay, so we
Cincinnatus
got
resigned the
Cincinnati
dictatorship
versus
and returned to his
Virginia.
farm, a hero in his own time and a legend thereafter. He would make one final appearance in the public record 20 years later, again appointed as dictator, though this time it was to deal with internal strife and
They
not an
love this
external
guy as
threat.
dictator.
Ironically, it was an attempt by a single man to capture total power in Rome that led to the reappointment of Cincinnatus as dictator. We will talk more next week about the plot of Malleus
Frame
to make
photo of
himself
Sardo the
king.
Hedgehog over my
So for
toilet.
now, I will just leave it
You
that a
gotta hold- you
conspiracy
gotta
was in motion.
hold it
and
for-
Cincinnatus
hold
was
it
brought
for
in to
Shadow.
deal with it, which he did
Or
as
piss it out
quickly
for
as he
Shadow.
dispatched the Aequians and again resigned the dictatorship and returned to his farm, this time for the last time. Cincinnatus is a bona fide legend, but the particulars of his
He's
life
very
are almost
epic,
certainly
actually.
an invention. I look forward to the day when I begin covering events from the later, more accurate records, so I won't have to keep saying that the story I've just told you is largely fictitious, but we still have another 50 years before we get to the sack of Rome, so we'll just have to grind through this together. Anyway, the story of Cincinnatus is largely fictitious, but the man was a giant of his age and earned a little mythical embellishment. And regardless of its accuracy, the life of Cincinnatus was handed down from generation to generation, and is still told today. His story had a great impact on the Enlightenment age soldiers of the American Continental Army.
You know, people
who
still
often
like
referred to their
visit
great
and pay
leader,
respects
General
to
Washington, as
Caesar's
the
grave.
American
They're like, oh, he was
Cincinnatus.
such a good dictator.
Because at the end of the
everybody."
war, he
So
retired
weird.
rather than allow the people to make him king.
Like, I'd see his grave, but I wouldn't like.
When the
kiss
army was
it, but that's apparently
demobilized, the
what folks are
retired
doing.
officers formed a fraternity of sorts called the Society of the Cincinnati. Membership in
Okay, I would
which
do it
was
as a
limited
fetish
to men
thing, but
who
I
had
wouldn't do
served
it
in
as
the
a
army
like
for 3 years.
unironic. Oh my god,
One
he
of
was
their
such a
members
good
was
dictator.
later the territorial
You know what I mean?
governor of Ohio, and he renamed a growing
a little
urban
weird.
hub on the Ohio River Cincinnati, both in honor of the society itself and in honor of Washington, to whom the name originally referred. Ironically, the society still exists today,
Pickaxe,
membership being
pickaxe,
limited to
pickaxe.
sons of the original members, making it a hereditary institution, completely anathema to everything the officers had originally been commissioned to fight. But I digress. Cincinnatus's mark had been set upon the world. But what do we make of him? Clearly he was a towering figure in the first century of the Republic, a hero, a consul, a twice-named dictator. But why the iconic veneration? Allegedly, it is for the act of relinquishing
Miss Ebola's all
absolute
that, but she
power.
doesn't get
But we
venerated
have
like
already
this
seen that
jackass does.
Cincinnatus was not the first man to do this, nor would he be the last.
Bullshit.
The office of dictator was not
Male
created
academia.
especially for him. It was, in fact, a constitutional role that was used regularly in times of crisis. His story, of course, had a nice ring to later Romans, who revel in his simple homespun virtue, called from his field to save the city. In the good old days, they said, the greatest man of his age was found hard at work on a small farm, not eating figs on a sofa in some palatial estate. He was the epitome of the virtuous farmer-soldier, the ideal Roman. I think two things really contribute to the fame of
And
Cincinnatus.
thank God he wasn't a woman,
The
because
first
I
is the
seriously
incidental
would
fact
throw
that
up.
most people, myself included before I began digging, believe Cincinnatus must have either been the first dictator of Rome or the only dictator of Rome to ever step down voluntarily, or something equally unprecedented. But of course there was nothing particularly unprecedented about Cincinnatus, and our veneration of him in that case would seem to be based upon nothing more than our own misconceptions about Roman history. But even though Cincinnatus wasn't the first or last of anything,
On God,
he
where are our
was
evil
unique in a
women?
profound way. The first
Miss
two
Ebola,
dictators who, like
Julius
Cincinnatus,
Caesar.
served and then resigned,
Queen.
were men of a generation that remembered the Tarquins, remembered the tyranny, and would not think for a moment about seizing power for themselves so
Wait, I
soon
need the
after they'd
pickaxe
thrown out
reference.
the
I'm-
kings.
Pickaxe.
Cincinnatus, on the other hand, comes from the next generation, a generation that lived their entire lives under the Republic, and was thus the first man who had no memory of
I
monarchy
mean, it's not fucking
to be
rocket
given
science.
absolute
It's a
power.
spike.
The temptation to keep it would not this time be tempered by memories of subjugation and struggle. But the virtue of Cincinnatus returned to the people the power that was rightfully theirs. It was his resignation from dictatorship that really cemented the precedent for later Romans to relinquish dictatorial power and maintain the republic, that thing of the people. In that case, Cincinnatus really does deserve all the praise he is given for selflessly handing the reins of power back to the people, where it would remain for hundreds of years.
I don't know,
In
man.
any case,
I feel
any
like
man
that's
who
just kind of
voluntarily
easy. Go back
gives
to
up
my
absolute
farm, dig a
power
bunch of
is
holes,
hero whose
or
story, rightfully, is told.
sit in office.
Next
I
week, we will
know
learn
exactly
more about the
what I would do.
machinations of Malleus, a scoundrel of the highest order, as well as the events that led up to the final confrontation with Veii, a struggle that broke the back of
Scoundrel.
Etruscan dominance, which, though a victory for Rome, opened the door for the Gauls to sweep in from the north and hand the Romans their most devastating defeat, almost ending the empire before it had a chance to really begin.
Lamau. Skill issue. Me when I yeehaw. I like the idea of someone rejecting tyranny simply because I'm too tired. I want to go to bed. Enough drawing, time to rub my brain with warfare again. Yes. Goodbye, democracy. We will now live on with democracy. If you vote for me, I will rename democracy to democracy.
All right, next episode. Excuse me. Sleepy.
Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. The years after the expulsion of the Decemvirate were hard. Old problems remained unsolved, while new ones threatened to tear the city apart. Patrician and plebe were at each other's throats over wealth, power, and land. The population of the city was growing, and there was not enough land to give them, and not enough food to feed them.
Oh my god. Okay.
Crop
hold
failures
up.
exacerbated the problem, and
Chat, there is someone who lives on this floor, and I have to speak quietly because my office is like right by our front door. There is someone who lives on our floor that anytime they open their door, it is like the reek of baked in cigarettes. And I've been theorizing, okay, because most places in Ontario don't really allow smoking indoors anymore, even if it's in your own apartment. Rental agreements often have like a clause in it that's just like, you will not smoke in here. You can smoke on the balcony, but you can't smoke in the apartment itself. It's a health and safety thing. I'm very grateful for it, especially considering this. But every time they open this door, reeking cigarettes, and what I expect is that they are an older person who's been smoking for at least 30 years in that apartment, and they've been like grandfathered in to the new rental people or something like that, and they're allowed to smoke in there because it's horrific. Like, we have an air purifier going on here, and it just, like, it's about to kick into hyper overdrive because through our closed door, through the gap under that closed door, it smells like a fucking bar. Like a South Florida still allowing smoking bar in here. It smells like baked in. My nose is in their couch, which has been marinating in their breath for decades. It's an assault. I cannot believe they're not dead yet, to be honest. But anyway, less about me, more about Rome.
famine became a persistent
Holy
killer.
shit, it stinks.
Bitter tensions led to a breakdown of military resolve, and old
Weed
enemies
and
long
cigarettes
contained
downstairs. Oh, I'm
now
so sorry.
returned a
It
match for their former
stinks.
betters. The Volscians and Aequians both peeled off
Listen,
Roman territory to the
My
east
father
and
or
south,
grandfather-in-law
and there-
smoked until the age of like 99, like a chimney, and he died again like age 98 or 99. So maybe he just lived with the smell, but
little the legions could do about it.
I'm sure it's
This is
something
how
you
the
can get
Romans
used to.
limped through the
But,
second
oh my
half
God.
of the 400s BC, hungry, tired, weak, and demoralized. At the turn of the century, a final victory over Veii would lift the hopes, albeit briefly, of the
Sometimes
city.
I'm like, oh, it's
But
kind of
for
sucks
now,
that smokers
life was a dreary
get a
war
little
of
bit of a short
attrition.
end of the stick on terms of like
In the aftermath of the
people
publication
just
of the
casually
12
being like,
Tables,
oh, smoking's
the
bad for
plebes
you, you know? It's like,
immediately
yeah,
became
thanks, I
aware
know.
of an institutionalized
But then I
bias
smell
against
that
them.
and I'm like, oh.
They were incensed to see a codification of the ban against patrician plebe marriage and immediately opened a new front in their war for equality. The issue of greatest concern was access to the high offices of state. This meant the consulship and the religious offices of Pontifex Maximus and its subordinate priesthoods. Only patricians by law could hold these offices, and if plebes could not intermarry with patricians, then they would never gain access to the highest positions of authority or have the final say in law and religion. The plebes attacked
together
this
tar
imbalance
nicotine.
from two angles. First, they sought to legalize
horror game
patrician
genre,
plebe
right? Or
intermarriage,
monster idea, yeah.
and second, they demanded that the consulship be open to plebe candidates. The former would be won quickly, and as to the latter, it would be just under 100 years before the first plebe was finally named consul in 366 BC. In 445, a tribune named Canuleius introduced a bill
Canuleius.
legalizing patrician plebe
Okay.
marriage.
Let me
The
just
measure was fought by
Canuleius
the
down to
patricians
the
who fretted about the dilution of pure patrician
Baius.
blood, but their resistance was only half-hearted. For one thing, their arguments really had no leg to stand on. When it came to officiating the necessary
arguers,
religious
gotcha.
sacrifices, the Romans, all of them, believed that a patrician must be the official in charge, or the gods would be offended. Some patrician families claimed
Gods are
that
gonna
mixing the
hate
two
that.
classes would inevitably offend the gods.
Yeah,
But in
Cletus,
Roman
the
law,
gods are
legal
gonna fucking
status
hate
followed the
that.
father's position alone, without any concept of genetic makeup. Incest, for example, did not even cover relations between maternal cousins. They were simply not considered part of the same family. So claims
Oh
about
God,
blood
you want to hear a
dilution
horror
came
show?
off as absurd.
Apparently,
Any child
New Scientist
born to
came
a
out with a new
patrician
article
father
saying
was a
that
patrician,
actually it's
period.
probably okay
Flimsy
to marry
racial
your first
arguments
cousin.
aside, the matter
Most of the
basically
time, it's
came down to
fine.
not wanting to share with the other children,
So,
and patrician
great
solidarity
news,
soon
everybody.
cracked. There were a number of noble families who eyed the fortunes of the wealthy plebe families, and the measure was soon passed. As to admission into the consulship,
Nah.
the patricians
Yeah, I'm
fought
good
much
too.
harder to prevent it, and far dirtier. This was not a toy that they were going to share with the other children. And so in 444 BC, right on the heels of plebes gaining at least nominal access to power, the
that's
consulship
probably
was
important
suspended,
research.
and the third manifestation of executive power was
But I'm glad I
inaugurated.
don't have to be
Military
the
tribunes
guy
with consular power.
who has to write the
The
paper.
switch was not permanent, though, and for the next
know?
80-odd years, the executive leadership of Rome alternated between the new military tribunes and the traditional dual consulship, depending on the circumstances of a given year. Initially, 3 military tribunes would be elected by the centuriata and granted executive authority over the state.
I'll breed with
though
myself
over the years,
before I
that
breed with
number
my
rose
cousin,
to
God.
4 and then to 6.
My cousins are all gingers.
The introduction of the new executive form can be seen as a move by the patricians to protect the consulship
I'm allowed to
from
say that
plebe
as a relative
taint.
of ginger.
No plebe could be consul if no consuls were elected. The military tribunes were elected democratically by the army, and plebes as well as patricians stood for and won election.
Like
This
my
was fine with the
ex-roommate,
patricians as long as the sanctity of
her-
the consulship itself was guarded.
her like second cousin is Viggo Mortensen. So like, well, I'm just gonna leave you with that thought. So like, second cousins is legal in Canada, and so like, I mean, if Viggo Mortensen was my second, I just leaving you with that. Yeah. Ah! Yeah. Okay, well, I'm glad that Viggo Mortensen is not my second cousin. How would if you... I don't like Ryan Reynolds. Ryan Reynolds good as hell. No particular reason, I just don't like Ryan Reynolds. Ryan Gosling, though. Okay, wait, no. No. Second cousin... Wait. Okay, answers my questions. No! No! Married couple who'd been adopted. Siblings after already having kids. Ugh. That's like the worst case scenario. Actually, no, there is a worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is you accidentally marry like a parent and have kids with your parents. Oh, God. Old boy is watching this. Yeah. Now, I'm kind of curious how, if, you know, how often the damage is in the case of siblings marrying and having kids. Like, I feel like 99 times out of 100, those kids would be fine. But it's the risk of interbreeding again with other sibling. Oh, God. Separate siblings. Yeah, that's like seems a huge fucking failure of the system. Yeah, it's fucked. I'm sure it happens all the time. Royal families of Europe and all of Alabama. Yeah, but that's like, you know, a couple of generations of inbreeding. But then again, if this was in Alabama, the chances of them being already inbred are kind of high, aren't they? Anyways, horrible conversation. Love it. We're turning on the history of Rome. I sure hope there's no incest in Rome.
Further, by increasing the number of executives, plebe ambition was mollified, and at the same time power was watered down, so that the elected plebes were not as singularly powerful as they would be if they had been consuls. Plus, the entire exercise kept plebes from agitating too hard for admission to the consulship. For the years between 444 and 367 BC, military tribunes were elected roughly half the time, the other years being governed by the traditional dual consuls. Much has gone into analyzing what factors determined whether consuls or tribunes.
This is so
would be
sad. If
elected
Zane
for a
goes to
given
check
year.
the VOD
But by
on his commission, he'll be like,
cross-referencing
"Oh, I wonder
executive
what
form
Rika
with
talked
military
about when she was
activity,
working on my
a
cool
possible answer
commission."
emerges.
Halfway through, it's talking
Consuls were
about
generally in
incest.
charge during the major conflicts of the era, so it would seem that
I
military
don't know why I'm
tribunes
giving
were
Zane
elected
such
when
a
no major
twangy
military
southern
action
accent.
was
It's 'cause
planned,
he's really good at
whereas
it.
consuls were elected when engagement was imminent. This seems counterintuitive given the name military tribune, but it makes sense. Plebes with consular power were acceptable to the patricians as long as they were destined for little more than off-year administrative duties. When real action was required, the patrician-controlled consulship was returned. The patricians wanted to make sure that they alone determined the course of state
idea for
in times
this.
of crisis. If this is true, then the creation of military tribunes with consular power was little more than a stall tactic formulated by the patricians to put off full political equality
Let's
with
give
the
them some
plebes,
tattoos.
which it
Let's
did
look up.
for the better part of 80 years. A second action by the patricians further removed the plebes from access to real power. One of the most important duties of the consuls was administering the census once every 5 years. The census determined citizen status as well as classification.
Yeah, we're gonna
within
give
the
him like a
five-tiered system
tattoo,
of the
but
communist
I'm like,
Centuriata.
ooh, what if it's a tattoo
The
of like
consuls
a
charged with
mind?
taking the census had enormous
That's-
latitude at the edges.
I'm
of
making this guy
dividing
like the
lines
most
to move
stereotypical
citizens up or
Appalachian. Like he's a
down,
coal miner.
granting a degree of control over the end voting blocks of the Centuriata. More than that, even, it was during the census that citizen status was granted or revoked. Obviously, the patricians had a keen interest in maintaining control of the census, and when military tribunes were introduced, the administration of the census was peeled off from the other consular powers and invested into a new office that was destined to become one of the most coveted of all the magistracies, the censor. In time, the censor would acquire other duties, most famously the vague directive to protect public morals. But for now, the single
Okay.
role of administering the census was important enough. By senatorial decree, the censor had to be a patrician, ostensibly because of the religious ceremonies of the census that needed attending to, but most likely it was to make sure that plebes could never engineer more favorable voting blocks for themselves in the Centuriata. These political reforms closed out the cycle initiated by Terentulus in 462 BC when he first proposed the creation of the 12 Table. The political and economic structure of Rome would not see significant alteration until the opening of the Samnite Wars in the mid-300s BC, not for lack of
So I don't
plebe
know why I gave him, like,
agitation,
a
but because the
modern-looking
patricians
pickaxe.
seemed to
Let's
have
wrap his
closed
handle
ranks
a
and
bit.
resisted any further reforms. As I said at the beginning, the years ahead were long and hard for Rome. Grain shortages were reported
Really
in
long
a dozen of the next 50
and
years,
really
with devastating
hard.
famines following. The lack of nourishment inevitably led to plagues, which further decimated the population.
Skills.
Rome was forced to seek help from surrounding communities, north in Etruria and south in Magna Graecia and Sicily. Their requests, though, were denied as often as they were approved, and many of their neighbors reveled in Rome's misery after so many years of dominance. Just about every one of their enemies took advantage of Rome's depleted and malnourished army, and Rome's sphere of influence gradually began to erode. The Volscians and Aequians, once easily dispatched, now let their flocks graze in Roman fields uncontested. In the midst of this desperation, some men allowed their scruples to take a backseat to ambition, and one man in particular would pay the ultimate price for his hubris. A wealthy
paddling.
merchant named Manlius, who had never served in any important office but was of
The
equestrian
children
rank,
yearn for the mines.
began to dream bigger than his prudence should have allowed. In 439 BC, during a typical grain famine,
Yeah, they need to
official
hurry up.
Roman envoys in
The
Etruria
English
rejected
royal
the
family needs to
Etruscan
interbreed
price for
more
grain
until
as
they just have
gouging
like a little
and
pink
returned to
lump.
the city empty-handed. Manlius then went himself and agreed to pay the exorbitant cost, bringing home the grain the people needed and handing it out for free. Manlius was an overnight sensation, a newly minted political rock star. Everywhere he went,
Yeah,
he
but
was
his name is
greeted by
Manlius,
large
so-
ovations acclaiming his generosity. Manlius looked at the adoring masses and at his own personal fortune and let his imagination get away from him. He moved quickly from dream to action and began to actively conspire against the state with the intention of making himself king.
Naughty.
The Republican government, he rationalized, had failed to protect and feed the people where he, Manlius, had succeeded. It was only right that he should rule.
You should rule,
He began
you guys.
cashing weapons and bribing the plebe leadership to rise with him when he made his move against the Senate. But alas,
I accidentally
it was
keep
not
killing
needed.
Cetus wildlife with
The state
Equinas.
controller of supplies, a man named Minucius, dealt daily with the same
Pink Lump
grain
is
merchants
crazy.
who dealt with Manlius, and soon learned about the plot. He went straight away to the Senate, who flew into a panic, recognizing their own unpopularity, coupled with the people's desperate state, might be enough to slip tyranny in the back door. The Senate needed a man whose fame and popularity outshone that of Manlius's to
Get
put a
one or
stop
two
to the
little more
conspiracy.
accents here. We can put another 5
As I
minutes
mentioned
into
last
this.
week, they went back to Cincinnatus, now well over 80, and appointed him dictator once again. All of
Cincinnatus,
Manlius's careful planning was
please.
undone in a moment. Cincinnatus sent his master of horse to fetch Manlius and bring him forward for a trial. Manlius, knowing that he was in deep trouble, attempted to resist the summons, and when he did, the master of horse cut him down where he stood. There was a brief popular uproar over the murder, but Cincinnatus legitimized the act, saying that Manlius was being summoned merely for trial, and that it was his refusal to appear, not his alleged criminal activity, that sealed his fate. Political order was restored.
Yeah,
and
but isn't he
Cincinnatus
allowed to
again
murder a
resigned.
potential tyrant anyway?
Soon after
Again,
the
isn't
death
that
of
like a
Manlius,
blank
an
check?
external threat emerged that would eventually lead Rome into its final definitive clash with Veii. The city of Fidenae, an Etruscan outpost on the Roman side of the Tiber, which had been under Roman control for some time, decided to revolt and called for Veii's help. They figured that Rome, weak internally and caught up in the south with intrusive tribes, would be forced to let the city go, but Rome was determined to maintain control. Hostilities began with Fidenae, hoping to goad Rome into a battle she would lose, murdered 4 visiting Roman envoys. This treacherous act did lead to an immediate Roman response, but no conclusive action was achieved on either side. The war with Veii-backed Fidenae dragged on for years. To the Romans, victory was a necessity. If they lost control of Fidenae, trade up the Tiber River would be severely hampered, but despite the Romans' best efforts, Fidenae held out, and trade suffered accordingly. Through the 430s and 420s BC, Rome found itself militarily engaged on 3 fronts, in the north, east, and south, economically isolated and politically divided. It was not a good time to be a Roman.
Yeah, it's fine.
Some relief came around 425 BC, when the Romans finally won back control over Fidenae, but Veii itself still loomed on the horizon. The Romans, for the moment, dreaded a fight with their rival, and did not follow up their recovery of Fidenae with action into Veii territory. A confrontation was brewing between the two powers. Their political and economic destinies were on a collision course, but for now a tense truce prevailed. Veii seemed to have been dealing with its own internal problems at the time, and so did not strike when the iron was hot, immediately at the end of a war which had drained Rome physically and emotionally. This gave the Romans a chance to catch their breath and consolidate their power. When the final clash with Veii finally erupted, the Romans were in a position to challenge their Etruscan rival on equal footing. The years leading up to the war with Veii were hard, but these decades would highlight the characteristic Roman obstinance that would win them an empire. The Romans simply did not give up. Beaten, harassed, tired, and divided, the Romans soldiered on. The Roman unwillingness to quit in the face of adversity bordered on the edge of insanity. They would accept catastrophic losses but would never surrender.
These guys are
In the
fucking
centuries
nuts.
that followed, Rome was many times beaten so badly that they should have relinquished their dreams of empire and retired to the dustbin of history. But instead, they buried the dead and raised a fresh army, never suing for peace and never retreating. It was this unwavering advance that so frightened Rome's enemies. In battle, legionaries would fall, but the line would keep marching incessantly forward, dispassionate, calm, and mechanical. There was no psyching out the legions or driving them to flight. They just kept coming. And if you decisively beat one Roman army, rather than surrendering like a civilized nation, the Romans raised another and set it against you, until more from exhaustion than anything else you were beaten, and inexplicably found yourself under the yoke of a foe you thought you had beaten. This was the Roman way,
Persistence hunting.
and during these hard years it was on full display. It has often been said
They
that
were
of some
filled with
generations
determination.
much is asked, and of others much is given. Of this generation much was
Yeah.
asked, and without
Wow.
even the promise
Good
of glory
analogy.
to soothe them. Their fights were not the
Rome on
great
its
wars that
genocide
made men
run.
famous. They were forced to deal with persistent skirmishes of attrition, which cost lives and profited no one. The Romans of the Middle Imperium, which Gibbon famously called the safest, most civilized, and most comfortable generation in history, bears no resemblance to the thin, desperate Romans of the late 400s BC.
In
But that
history,
future was secured by the sacrifice of these early suffering generations, of whom much was asked and nothing was given.
we're probably doing pretty okay now.
I'll close
with
tonight with a
antibiotics.
rare programming note. I am going on vacation, so there will be no new episode next week.
What?
But fear not, we will return in 2 weeks and trace the final conflict with Veii, Rome's very own Trojan War,
What the
complete with
fuck?
victory secured by sneak attack, and introduce a giant of the early republic, Marcus Furius Camillus, known as the second founder of
I
Rome.
fucking love this guy. This may be my
Until
finest
then,
work,
I want to thank
unironically.
all of you who have subscribed and supported the history of Rome since it began. It has been an immensely
Holy shit,
gratifying
Rome won because it
experience,
could save.
and all
It's
of you out there
the
listening have made
stalker.
it possible. Thank you.
Stalker,
And I will see you in 2 weeks.
F5 a lot. What's it for? I fucking love this guy. Yeehaw. Alright, I'm gonna call that one done. Oh, stretch break. Alright. That was me stretching. It would have been like a fucking soundscape of Breaking Bones if I had kept my mic on, so. Alright, we got another commission here for my good friend Wild, who I think they're still snoozing. Their poor sleep schedule. I put them last just in case they would wake up in time, but I think they're still eepy. Insert Lenny face. More. Oh, wait, Lenny. Oh, wait, Wild is here. Yeah, wait, I thought I saw you earlier. That's so weird. You're not in like the list of. I checked my list of current viewers, but you weren't in there, so I was just like, oh, they're gone, or oh, they went back to sleep. It's back to you though, Wild. ChatGPT is going off the rails. This post has something about it, something fucky. I think it was a picture of like Clive Owen or something like that. No, Colin Farrell. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a pretty good man spread. Also, while looking up man-spreading poses, I am either pleased or extremely displeased to tell you all that there are people who dedicate whole Pinterest boards to hot man-spreaders. You know. I mean, I guess that's not as bad as knowing that like people do whole Pinterest boards of like hot Asian women or whatever. Is this Gianni? No. No, you want Gianni Slime Girl, don't you? No, we gotta finish this one and then we'll get a Gianni Slime Girl. Probably only half an hour though, because I have some Viscera Fest stuff to work on. Revisions. I hate revisions so much. Not what I'm saying. Okay. Yeah, right. You want a Gianni Slime Girl so bad it makes you look like a goober. But okay, let's get the next episode up. Oh, I went back too far. No. This one's called Decades of Gloom. Alright.
Hello, and welcome to the history of Rome. The years after the expulsion of the Decemvirate were hard. Old problems remained unsolved, while new ones threatened to tear the city apart. Patrician and plebe were at each other's throats over wealth, power, and land. The population of the city was growing, and there was not enough land to give them, and not enough food to feed them. Crop failures exacerbated the problem, and famine became a persistent killer. Bitter tensions led to a breakdown of military resolve, and old enemies long contained now returned a match for their former betters. The Volscians and Aequians both peeled off Roman territory to the east and south, and there was little the legions could do about it. This is how the Romans limped through the second half of the 400s BC, hungry, tired, weak, and demoralized. At the turn of the century, a final victory over VA would lift the hopes, albeit briefly, of the city. But for now, life was a dreary war of attrition. In the aftermath of the publication of the 12 Tables, the plebes immediately became aware of an institutionalized bias against them. They were incensed to see a codification of the ban against patrician plebe marriage, and immediately opened a
Get
new
over there, you
front in their
fucking
war
fuckboy,
for
Jesus.
equality. The issue of greatest concern was access to the high offices of state.
Do you
This meant
think he
the
has any sense of
consulship
personal
and the
space,
religious
this guy?
offices of Pontifex Maximus and its subordinate priesthoods. Only
I think it could
patricians
go either
by
way.
law could hold these
Wild,
offices,
what's your
and
thoughts
if
on
plebes
that?
could not intermarry with patricians, then they would never gain access to the highest positions of authority or have the final say in law and religion. The plebes attacked this imbalance from two angles. First, they sought to legalize
whoops.
patrician-plebe intermarriage, and second, they demanded that the consulship be open to plebe candidates. The former would be won quickly, and as to the latter, it would be just under 100 years before the first plebe was finally named consul in 366 BC. In 445, a tribune named Canuleius introduced a bill legalizing patrician-plebe marriage. The measure was fought by the patricians, who fretted about
Sorry,
the
what? I got
dilution of
distracted by
pure
my
patrician
cat being a
blood,
nuisance.
but their
Based.
resistance was only half-hearted.
V,
For one thing,
does
their
he have a
arguments
concept of
really
personal
had
space?
no leg to stand on. When it came to officiating the necessary religious sacrifices, the Romans, all of them, believed that a patrician must be the official in charge.
Thank you,
or
A
the
is a boring
gods
name.
would be offended. Some patrician families claimed that mixing the two classes would inevitably offend the gods, but in Roman law, legal status followed the father's position alone.
Class
without any concept
mixing?
of genetic makeup. Incest, for example, did not even cover relations between maternal cousins. They were simply not considered part of the same family. So claims about blood dilution came off as absurd. Any child born to a patrician father was a patrician, period. Flimsy racial arguments aside, the matter basically came down to not wanting to share with the other children, and patrician solidarity.
Funny how it always
seemed
comes
cracked.
down to that, huh?
There were a number of noble families who eyed the fortunes of the wealthy plebe families, and the measure was soon passed.
Incest mentioned
As
again,
to admission into
unfortunately.
the consulship,
No concept of
the
personal
patricians
space,
fought
magnificent.
Much harder
Okay,
to prevent it, and far dirtier.
then I
This
better
was
zoom
not
in.
a toy that they were going to share with the other children. And so in 444 BC, right on the heels of plebes gaining at least nominal access to power, the consulship was suspended, and the third manifestation of executive power was inaugurated.
Rome is true. Yeah, I was talking a
Military
lot of shit
tribunes
earlier,
with
but this
consular
truly is
power.
more like America than we all
The
thought.
switch was not
So
permanent,
unfortunate.
though, and for the next 80-odd years, the executive leadership of Rome alternated between the new military tribunes and the traditional dual consulship, depending on the circumstances of a given year. Initially, 3 military tribunes would be elected by the centuriata and granted executive authority over the state, though over the years that number rose to 4 and then to 6. The introduction of the new executive form can be seen as a move by the patricians to protect the consulship from plebe taint. No plebe could be
Taint.
consul if no consuls were elected. The military tribunes were elected democratically by the army, and plebes as well as patricians stood for and won election. This was fine with the patricians as long as the sanctity of the consulship itself was guarded.
The sanctity
Further,
of the
by increasing the
consulship.
number of executives, plebe ambition was mollified, and at the same time power was watered down, so that the elected plebes were not as singularly powerful as they would be if
You
they had
wanted to
been
give him
consuls.
little elf ears. Is that accurate? That
Plus,
surely
the
is
entire
accurate. He doesn't
exercise
have elf
kept
ears.
plebes from agitating too hard for
No, he has
admission
normal
to the
ears. Jeez.
consulship. For the years between 444 and 367 BC, military tribunes were
I
elected
see a goatee. I
roughly half
assume
the
there's going to
time,
be like a little
the
elf
other
and
years
devil
being
boy,
governed by the
you know?
traditional dual consuls. Much has gone into analyzing what factors determined whether consuls or tribunes would be elected for a given year, but by cross-referencing executive form with military activity, a possible answer emerges. Consuls were generally in charge during the major conflicts of the era, so it would seem that military tribunes were elected when no major military action was planned, whereas consuls were elected when engagement was imminent. This seems counterintuitive given the name military tribune, but it makes sense. Plebes with consular power were acceptable to the patricians as long as they were destined for little more than off-year administrative duties. When real action was required, the patrician-controlled consulship was returned. The patricians wanted to make sure that they alone determined the course of state in times of crisis. If this is true, then the creation of military tribunes with consular power was little more than a stall tactic formulated by the patricians to put off full political equality with the plebes, which it did for the better part of 80 years. A second action by the patricians
Cheeky
further
of them.
removed the plebes from access to real power. One of the most important duties of the consuls was
don't like this.
administering a census once every 5 years. The census determined citizen status as well as classification
America's
within the
meth
five-tiered
lab.
system of the communist centuriata. The
Stereotyping
consuls
elf
charged with
ears to
taking the
people who
census
don't
had
know about
enormous
personal
latitude at
space.
the
I
edges
see
of the
you.
dividing lines to move citizens up
Sorry,
or down,
I am racist
granting a
against
degree
elves.
of control over the end voting blocks of the centuriata. More than that even, it was during the census that citizen status was granted or revoked. Obviously, the patricians had a keen interest in maintaining control of the census, and when military tribunes were introduced, the administration of the census was peeled off from the other consular powers and invested into a new office that was destined to become one of the most coveted of all the magistracies, the censor.
I'll redraw this goatee.
In time, the censor
right
would
now.
acquire other duties, most famously the vague directive to protect public morals. But for now,
Wait,
the single
we already
role of
listened to this
administering
episode.
The census was important enough. By senatorial decree, the censor
Unless
had
he's
to
going
be
over,
patrician,
he's rehashing
ostensibly because of the religious ceremonies
the past
of the census
episode.
that he was
Guys,
attending to,
y'all, I'm
but
fucking
most likely
stupid.
it was to make sure that plebes could never
Hold up.
engineer more decisively bears no resemblance to the thin. Until then, I want to thank all of you who have subscribed and supported the history.
Y'all. My ass is stupid. Next episode. I was like, so we're still on the inequality of the plebes and incest, huh? Oh my god.
Hello, and welcome to the history of Rome.
I'm also racist against elves. But
Last
also
time,
towards elves.
we left Rome on an upbeat. Fidenae recovered, and their position in the region stabilized. The Volscians were still a persistent menace to the south, but by this time they were clearly on the decline militarily. In another few decades, Rome would finally put an end to the Volscian threat and conquer them once and for all. But for now, periodic clashes continued to be a mainstay of legion activity. The main threat to Rome, though, lay north with the city-state of Veii, long an economic, political, and military rival. When not clashing with Veii directly, the Etruscan city had
Save
bankrolled
the
Rome's
hair
enemies
for
and fought by proxy. After years of avoiding conflict because they were stretched too thin, the Romans finally felt secure enough to challenge their northern rival openly and committed themselves to a war that would determine who controlled central Italy. As I mentioned earlier, Veii was the southernmost member of the Etruscan League, a loose confederation of 12 city-states that controlled Italy from the Tiber north to the Po Valley. Other members of the League included Tarquini, birthplace of Tarquinius Priscus, the fifth king of Rome, and Clausium, home of Lars
Tarquinius
Porsenna, who either
Priscus.
did or did not conquer Rome. Had there been any solidarity between the cities, it is doubtful Rome would have emerged triumphant from its war with Veii, but the League served an economic and cultural function rather than a political and military one. This failure to unite would ultimately spell the end for the Etruscans, who, in addition to pressure from Rome in the south, suddenly faced the threat of migrating Gauls, who were passing through the Alps into the
But
Po
boy,
Valley and
could
squeezing
they
the Etruscans out of land
make
in the
urns.
north. The third prong of the assault that would mark the end of Etruscan power was the ascendancy of Syracuse, the powerful Greek city in Sicily, who bottled up the Carthaginians, long an Etruscan economic and military
Oh god, they
ally,
put them in a
preventing
jar.
any
They put
outside
they
aid
put the
from reaching
Carthaginians in a
besieged
jar.
Etruscan
No.
cities. Syracuse had just put itself on the map by defeating an Athenian invasion force in 413 BC, and now ambitiously sought to control all mainland Italy. But, getting back to the topic at hand, the war between Rome and Veii was inevitable. Veii lay a mere 12 miles north of Rome, far too close for the two powers to coexist peacefully
Sleepy
forever.
kitty.
Eventually, economic
the
necessity
baby.
drove them both
I gotta
conclusion that
go!
the other had to be eliminated.
Have a good one.
The region was simply not big enough for the both of them. There were three basic points of economic conflict that could not be resolved peacefully. The first was control of the lucrative salt beds at the mouth of the Tiber. Almost all the inland communities relied on the Tiber beds as their source of salt, and whoever controlled the source controlled a reliable cash cow.
Could you guys
But
say
the beds lay
whoever
mostly on the
controlled
north bank of the river, and so were controlled
Whoever-
by Veii. The
whoever
Romans looked
controlled
on
the
with
salt
envy, and for years sought to dislodge
control the
Veians,
universe?
but were never in a
Could you
position
guys
to
say
do
that?
so. Now it seemed the time was ripe to make their move. The Romans wanted to control the beds, but Veii was not going to give them up without a fight. The salt trade was so important because of the economic conditions at the time, economic conditions that made the world too small for both powers. After the Etruscans had lost their foothold south of Rome to the Volscians, their direct connection to trade with Magna Graecia was severed. The archaeological record shows that the flood of trade Veii had once enjoyed as the gateway to Etruria now slowed to a trickle. Their overland trade routes closed, the Viets were forced to rely on seafaring traders, most importantly their Carthaginian allies, But after the rise of Syracuse, those Carthaginian traders began to be squeezed out, and Villa's economy suffered as a result. In better days, northbound trade was ample enough to be split between Veii and Rome, but now the limited supply was not enough to supply two economic centers. One had to be eliminated or both would die. Finally, there was the basic issue of territory. Rome's population was expanding, but its territory was not. Veii controlled huge tracts of fertile land that all levels of Roman society coveted. The richest patrician and the poorest plebeian both saw the land north of the Tiber as the answer to their overpopulation crisis. The patricians wanted the land to relocate the landless plebes, who were agitating with escalating fervor to redistribute patrician land in a more equitable manner, and the plebes just wanted land, whatever the source.
Land this, equity this.
The need to control the salt markets, the need to
It's
control the
always the
sparse
same with
overland
these
trade
plebes,
with Magna
huh?
Graecia, and the need
So
to control
greedy.
the land north of the Tiber finally drove the Romans to action, and around 400 BC, it was decided to take Veii out once and for all. The Veiites, equally
Magnificent
defined,
good.
were more than
I
willing to
searched.
take up the fight, and the
And I was
final
like, ooh, is that
conflict was
close?
joined.
One or two of them got
The
close,
war
and then I
with
saw
Veii
this
was
one. I was
unlike
like, oh
any
yeah,
the
that's
Romans
perfect.
had undertaken thus far, and the battle would change the nature and character of the Romans
Slutty.
forever. Livy dates the conflict as taking place between 402 and 392 BC, and the archaeological record tends to back up this chronology, though not completely. The traditional length given for the war is
Darn,
10
it's
years,
back.
but most historians agree that this number was lifted from the mythical Trojan War,
Welcome back.
and that the actual conflict more likely lasted 6 or 7 years. Battles in the field were intermittent and inconclusive, leading the Romans to change tactics and besiege Veii itself rather than try and beat its army in the field. This forced the Romans to do something they had never before even
Make out with the
contemplated,
enemy army. Have a
keeping an
make
army
out
in the
of
field year-round.
Oh.
Traditionally, the campaign season lasted between April and October, with soldiers returning home for the winter.
Because they
It was
have to,
completely
to grab
unprecedented to
crops.
keep an army enrolled past October, but after the decision was made to lay siege to Veii, this is exactly what happened.
Yeah.
The soldiers
That's
suffered this
risky.
outrage only because the Senate introduced an innovation that would mark a turning point in Roman history: soldier
Slavery.
pay.
Soldier pay.
It was not a great sum, nor was it a permanent policy, but it set a precedent and marked the first step on the long road toward the establishment of a fully professional army,
Huh.
a road that led directly to the death of the Republic.
Oh.
For now, though, it was an expedient to keep an army in the field at a time when the soldiers had to return home to look after their farms. The pay alleviated
Again,
the economic
to
burden
harvest
the
their
soldiers
farm, not
faced
just look
and kept
after
them
it.
fighting.
It's vital. It's
siege
so
soon
common
turned
that
into a
like
prolonged
Byzantium
siege. The
goes by
Roman-
those rules. Like most societies go by that rule of at this time of campaign during from like after sowing until harvest, and then return to harvest your crops. Like the crops go bad in the field otherwise.
Romans wanted nothing more than a quick, decisive victory, but Veii was situated in a nearly impregnable position.
Soldier pay, never mind. Roman isn't
Bounded on
anything
three
like
sides by
America.
cliffs, only a narrow strip of land north of the city offered a level entrance. The Romans managed to gain control of that strip. And
What do
cut
you mean?
Veii
All
off
those
from the
Florida
rest of the world,
recruiters I saw
but they were never
said
able to do much
there's
more than
tons of benefits to joining the
The
army.
Veiites were able to concentrate their total defensive capabilities on that one accessible point,
Like getting
and so the Romans were unable to make any headway. Though not far from home, again, Veii was
God,
only
I'm so
12
glad I
miles
didn't join the
from
reserves,
Rome.
dog.
The soldiers were
would I be
forced to remain
drawing
in
sexy
camp through
men
the
right
winter
now if I
and
joined
began to
the
grumble with
reserves?
the injustice of remaining
Actually,
in arms.
probably, but it's not
The
the point.
tribunes railed against the policy, claiming that the siege was a patrician policy dedicated more to getting influential plebes out of the city than actually winning the war. Look at Veii, they said. What army could possibly take it by force? It was absurd.
No, not getting killed.
Soldiers
It's
were
called
kept on
adventuring.
year
Literally,
after year,
I
their farms
just
falling into
had a
disrepair, and their
forces.ca
families falling into
poster
poverty,
that was like,
despite
or a
whatever pay was
Pinterest
coming
ad that
from
was
the
just like,
treasury.
It's your
All
call
in
to
able siege that showed no
adventure.
promise of
And I'm
being
like,
brought to a successful conclusion. A great many were sympathetic to this view, and the will of the army began to waver. Into this
If I wanted
depressed
adventure,
state
I'd
came
go
one of
into the
great
woods with no
heroes of Roman
backpack, like,
history, Marcus Furius
please.
Camillus. Of patrician descent, Camillus had been elected military tribune 3 times over the course of the war, distinguishing himself on the battlefield and running a notoriously disciplined ship. The Senate and the people were both increasingly dissatisfied with the military leadership, who seemed more willing to fight amongst themselves than unite behind a winning strategy. So, sick of the inconclusive bickering, they turned to Camillus, whose record spoke for itself, and elected him to the first of his unprecedented 5 dictatorships. Later crises
how
would
come you
keep
get
the
5
Romans coming back to
dictatorships?
him again and again, and it was the reputation he established for himself
Pele.
at Veii that kept them coming back. What looked like a never-ending siege would be brought to completion within his 6-month term of office. Camillus knew as well as anyone that a direct assault on the city was doomed to failure, so he set his mind on devising some other way to gain access. It did not take long for him to notice the Viites' extensive sewer system and
If I
how
wanted
easy it
adventure,
would
I'd
be
leave
to
the
breach the
house.
city from underneath.
So true, bestie.
He set his army digging in shifts around the clock, making a tunnel from the Roman camp to one of the drainage pipes that ran under the city.
Okay,
He
that sounds like an
periodically ordered
adventure. I take it
attacks on
back.
the walls to keep the Viites busy, and they never caught on to the plan. It was now only a matter of time before the legions would come pouring in. Finally, the Romans reached the underground sewer system and followed it to the middle of the city. A raiding party was sent above, emerging from a temple and making straight away for the gates. Camillus ordered the bulk of his army in a frontal attack, which must have seemed like madness to the Viites until the company of Romans appeared in their midst and opened the gates from within. The Romans did indeed come pouring in, and it was the end for Veii. Camillus and the Romans were not interested in terms of surrender or indemnities. They wanted to destroy Veii completely. The men were slaughtered and the women and children sold into slavery. The city was sacked and pillaged, with all its movable wealth finding a new home in the rucksack of some legionnaire. Prior to final victory, Camillus had made a fateful promise that 1/10 of the spoils of war would be dedicated to Apollo, but in the commotion of victory his promise was forgotten, and everything was piled into the baggage train undivided. The great Etruscan city of Veii had fallen, never to rise again. Upon returning to Rome, the victorious Camillus was awarded a well-earned triumph, though the procession would mark the beginning of his famous undoing, and would soon find
I think
him
the
exiled
triumph
from
is
the
where you
city
get
he
to
had just led
embody
to victory.
Saturn for a day.
Riding at the head of his army, Camillus
Or
was pulled on his
Jupiter.
chariot by 4 white horses, traditionally an honor reserved only for kings. The inhabitants of the city whispered to one another that Camillus fancied himself a monarch, and began to look at him not as a conquering hero, but as a potential tyrant. His fate was sealed when, after the soldiers had returned home with their booty, Camillus began to worry about his unfulfilled promise to Apollo. Finally, he issued an order that all soldiers had to produce 1/10 of their treasure and hand it over to the state in order to appease the gods.
Oh dear.
The citizens were outraged, but complied out of their well-ingrained sense of religious obligation. They were further incensed when Camillus and the Senate announced that 1/10 of Veii's land would also be set aside for Apollo. The land-starved masses could not believe their ears, and it was really only a matter of time before they lashed out at their erstwhile hero. A year or two passed, and a tribune finally brought charges against Camillus for mishandling the wealth taken from Veii. Rather than face a hostile and humiliating trial, Camillus decided to leave the ungrateful Romans to their fate and went into voluntary exile.
Fuck you guys.
Legend has it that as he left, he offered a prayer that if he was innocent, that the gods should cause his former countrymen to regret his departure. A pure fabrication, but to the Romans, the sight of a massive barbarian invasion did indeed make them soon regret the absence of their best military commander. The victory over Veii marked a turning point for Roman history, as well as Italian history as a whole. Veii was one of the richest cities of Etruria, and its sack marked the beginning of the end of Etruscan dominance in northern Italy.
Don't think this is quite
In the
right
north,
wrist
Gauls from
pose
Central
here.
Europe began to cross en masse
good
into the
hand,
Po
but-
Valley, sweeping through Etruscan defenses and settling in Etruscan lands. The Etruscans thus found themselves squeezed between the Gallic migration and the Roman expansion.
Adventure D's nuts.
As I said earlier, military and political solidarity might have helped
We'll come
them
back
beat
to
off the attacks, but the
it looks so good,
independent-minded
but
Etruscans
again,
kept to themselves, and
It's
so
not
saw their cities
quite
fall one
posed
by
right.
one. It would not be a quick
Okay.
decline. Indeed, we will find them continuing to fight Rome throughout the Samnite Wars, but they would never again have the power
Okay,
or
we'll get back to that.
prestige they had so recently enjoyed. In the end, they would all fall under Rome's yoke and find themselves servants where they had once been masters. Although the push from the Gauls helped precipitate Etruscan decline, it also prevented the end from coming too quickly. The Romans, flushed with victory, may well have continued to push north and defeat all the Etruscan cities one by one. However, a force of Gauls moved south through Etruria all the way to the gates of Rome, where they would decisively beat the Romans, handing them a defeat that would leave the city burned to the ground and its citizens debating not which Etruscan city they should attack next, but whether or not to abandon their ruined city completely. Next week, we we will cover the sack of Rome and the return of Camillus, an event that would close a historical epoch, marking the end of the beginning for Rome.
Damn, we're speeding through it. Which friggin' tab did I put this stupid podcast in? Here we go. Barbarians at the gate. Okay.
Hello.
When was
and
this?
welcome to the history of Rome. I would
Okay,
like
there's
to
like
start
multiple
this week with a
sackings of
correction.
Rome.
In the episode Decades
Sixth
of Rome,
infamous
I
sacking
told the
of
story of a wealthy grain merchant
The Gauls,
who attempted
okay.
to
What
usurp
year?
Republican control and install himself as king.
387 BC.
The
Okay,
grain
yeah, we are
merchant in question
sailing
was
through
not
this
named
history.
Manlius, as I mistakenly said, but rather Malleus.
What?
We are about to meet a patrician named Manlius, who will soon find himself embroiled in a conspiracy to overthrow
Speak
the
up.
government. But
Oh.
he bears no relation to the Malleus, who tried to use a grain famine to his personal
Cornflake.
advantage in 439 BC. I regret the error. I would also like to say that those of you who are noticing an improvement in audio quality are not hallucinating. I have recently upgraded my recording equipment. My only concern about this switch is that my previous efforts will now seem poor cousins in comparison to these new episodes. Please do not hold it against those episodes. It is not their fault. They were merely the victims of inferior equipment.
Okay.
The Romans were riding high after their decisive triumph over Veii. The defeat of their longtime Etruscan rival had left the Romans an economic powerhouse. They now controlled the lands north of the Tiber and began resettlement almost immediately. The crops from the rich Etruscan soil promised an end to the cycle of grain famines that had plagued Rome for the last 50 years. They also became the hub of commerce in central Italy and took sole possession of the all-important salt trade, exponentially increasing Roman wealth. Things were looking good for the Romans, but fate was about to deal them a cruel blow. In an instant they would crash down from the highest high to the lowest low and find themselves wandering aimlessly amidst the burned-out rubble of their city, wondering how the gods could have forsaken them so quickly and so completely.
Well, maybe they shouldn't have been so
The
stupid.
barbarian sack of Rome would be one of the most traumatizing events in Roman history, and leave the Romans in fearful awe of the Gauls until Julius Caesar finally exorcised their psychological demons 350 years later. Rome would survive, but just barely, and not without lasting damage. Now I say that the Gauls sacked Rome, but that is too broad a description. The label Gaul was a catch-all used by the Romans to describe numerous independent tribes who lived in and around the Alps. There was no sense of union between the Gallic tribes themselves, apart from occasional alliances, and for the most part they fought as much amongst themselves as they did against any foreign race. The particular tribe that sacked Rome was called the Senons, and they were led by a strong warrior chieftain named Brennus. They had come over the Alps into the Po Valley in the previous century, and settled along the Adriatic coast. This brought them into conflict with the Etruscans, who had previously controlled the land, and it was this conflict that brought the Senons into conflict with Rome. There is an official legend that explains Brennus's decision to leave the Adriatic and move south to attack Rome, as well as a modern interpretation that puts the attack in a wider geopolitical context of Italian realpolitik. The official legend is that Brennus attacked the Etruscan city of Clusium, who sent envoys to Rome desperately seeking assistance. The Romans were no great friend
yeah, I
of
gotta put it on
Clusium,
this side.
who had backed the hated King Tarquin in his bid to regain the throne 100 years before,
The yucky
but the Romans
King
knew the Gauls
Tarquin.
were an enemy to be wary of, and so sent envoys to Clusium to take stock of the situation and report back how deeply Rome should involve itself. When they arrived, however, the Roman envoys immediately recognized the horde of barbarians as a real threat to all Italy, and agreed to help Clusium right then and there. These envoys wound up leading Clusium's army against the Gauls, and in the fighting a Gallic chieftain was killed. Brennus took offense to this. He felt that the diplomatic nature of their mission precluded the envoys from taking part in hostilities. He sent his own envoys to Rome to demand retribution, but the Romans, in their infinite wisdom, decided that rather than handing the envoys over to Brennus, would elect them military tribunes for that year instead. At this further insult, Brennus ordered his people to march south, where he would teach the ill-mannered Romans a lesson.
Fuck these guys.
Modern historians doubt that such a minor incident would lead Brennus to suddenly move his tribe south and attack one of the most heavily fortified cities in Italy. They postulate and there's some evidence to back it up, that Brennus had come to an agreement with Dionysius of Syracuse to tie the Romans up while Syracuse made their move to dominate Sicily. The Romans had historically been the allies of a Sicilian city called Messana, and Dionysius would have been eager to prevent Rome from sending troops in support of a city that he was trying to capture. Thus, an arrangement was
Handsome
made between
fella.
Syracuse and the Gauls
Have
to
a good
attack
one, Bio
Rome and keep
Meshi.
them occupied
Thanks for
while
dropping in.
Dionysius made his move.
Do you ever go to
This
used
seems
bookstores or
plausible,
libraries just to
but
enjoy
we will
the
never
old
know for
book
sure
smell?
exactly
Yeah.
why Brennus suddenly decided to march on Rome. We are not only unsure
Sometimes
of why
I go
the
in and
Gauls
get some
attacked,
reference books,
but also
too.
when the attack actually took place. The confusion, again, is caused by the scarcity of accurate records prior to the event. Traditional Roman history records that the sack took place in 390 BC, though that date is derived from the often incomplete magisterial election rolls that later Romans used to calculate dates of past events. We will encounter this problem again when Livy makes the implausible claim that between 375 and 370 BC, no magistrates of any kind were elected. Livy explains this as being the result of a patrician plebe political deadlock, but most likely he was just trying to reconcile what the electoral roll said with what his own backwards chronology was telling him. Modern historians, cross-referencing with the more accurate Greek records, place the sack of Rome in 387 or 386 BC. So we are not entirely sure why the Gauls marched on Rome, nor entirely sure when they did so.
It's just
But we do know who marched, the Senons, and we know where they marched, from the Adriatic coast to Rome, and we know how they got there, they walked, and we know what happened when they got there.
They sacked Rome.
And 4 out of 6 is not bad when you're talking about things that happened 2,500 years ago.
Excuse me.
The Romans were aware of the Gallic advance and enlisted one of the largest armies they had ever assembled to battle a single enemy, with plausible estimates ranging from anywhere from 12 to 25,000 men. They gathered at the Allia River, actually more of a brook than a river, and waited for the barbarians to appear on the horizon. When they did, the Romans were immediately on the fearful defensive. The Gauls were like nothing they had ever seen before.
Yeah, they're so yucky.
Huge and painted, bearded, with long hair, roaring all manner of crazy battle cries. The Gauls were a fearsome sight, and when they charged full speed directly at the Roman line, it did not take long before the Romans broke.
They wussied out.
The wings of the Roman army, composed of the lightly armed lower-class soldiers, were easily routed and fled for home, leaving the heavily armed center phalanx to be surrounded and massacred.
You
It
guys?
was the worst defeat the Romans had suffered at this point in their history,
That is
but
really
their
funny.
nightmare was only just beginning.
Sorry to all Romans.
In their haste to save themselves, the fleeing soldiers made directly for the fortified Capitol Hill citadel, leaving the walls of the city unguarded and the gates wide open. The remaining inhabitants of the city either fled outright or followed the soldiers into the citadel, giving free range of the city to the pursuing Gauls.
I bet the Gauls couldn't
incredulous
fucking
at the lack of
believe it, yeah.
resistance and believing it to be some sort of trap, actually waited a full day before they were satisfied it was no trick.
That
and
is
entered the city.
That is
An
hilarious.
initial attempt to take the capital failed, so Brennus, rather than waste his manpower
Yeah, I
in
think we're gonna
pointless
redraw that
fighting,
hand.
decided to settle in and starve the Romans out, meanwhile stripping the city of all its movable wealth.
Whoa.
The siege of the capital began to be measured not in days or weeks, but in months, without any sign of the deadlock breaking. The besieged Romans grew more and more desperate as their supplies and morale ran out.
Did you finish
The
reading
Gauls
that
were
message?
faring
There's
no
a surprise
better.
at the end.
The hot
I
Italian
wish they had
summer
something
was
like that,
not
but
what
with
the
old
northern
stinky
tribes
shoes
were
I could
used
do-
to, and they began to drop like flies. Disease ran rampant, and Brennus saw his force dwindle daily in the
Not a
foreign
fan
climate.
of that.
It was a race to the bottom as both sides hoped to hold out one day longer than their equally beleaguered foe. At one point, the Romans were nearly defeated, but were saved at the last minute in dramatic fashion.
That's what they
A
got thrift
messenger
stores
had been
for
sent
anyway.
from the capital
Get
to
tons
make
of old man
contact
stinky
with
feet in there.
Camillus, their exiled hero, to plead with him to bring
Life
a
hack.
force to lift the siege and save his former countrymen. The messenger scaled down an unguarded cliff, but the Gauls noticed the route and themselves attempted to scale the same cliff and break into the citadel. But famously, as they climbed, the sacred Capitoline geese, who the Romans had brought with them into the citadel, were roused and began to make a racket. The Romans, led by a patrician soldier named Manlius, were tipped off to the danger and drove the
Manlius.
barbarians off the wall,
They gotta
preventing the
stop.
only real attempt to take the Romans by force. Manlius, For his quick action and bravery was lauded as a hero,
Okay.
but in a few years he would be executed for treason not far from the site of these heroics,
Oops.
a tragic victim of his own vanity. The siege stretched to 7 months, and both sides were at the breaking point. In their respective desperate straits, they both agreed to something neither would have considered at the start. The Romans would pay the Gauls to leave the city.
Yo.
Both considered this a dishonorable end to the fight,
Yeah, but
but the Romans had to get off the Capitol Hill, where they would all die, and Brennus, who wanted nothing more than to get out of the hot, diseased city, was now able to do so and still claim victory. The Romans agreed to pay the Gauls 1,000 pounds of gold, and scales were brought in to measure the amount. As the gold was being weighed, however, the Romans noticed that the scales had been tampered with, and the pounds were much heavier than they should have been. They complained, and in response Brennus threw his sword onto the scales, further increasing the imbalance, and stating famously, "Woe to the conquered." The Romans stifled their objections and measured out the remaining gold, fuming but unable to do anything. The story of the sack of Rome, in reality, probably ended here, with the Gauls withdrawing north after being paid off. However, later Romans spread a thick coat of triumphant propaganda
Duh.
over the end of the story to save themselves the embarrassment of admitting to such a dishonorable conclusion, just as they added the story of Mucius Scaevola to the end of the war with Clusium to avoid admitting that they had been beaten by Lars Porsena. In the Roman Hollywood ending,
Ah, my
Camillus
bones.
is reached
Ah,
and
my
raises a
bones.
force from the neighboring Latin
old
tribes
man foot
and
smell.
marches on the city. He arrives just after the Gauls have been paid,
Mods.
and, finding them sleeping
Mods,
off
can
their
we send a-
triumph,
can we send
attacks
a-
and beats
can
the
we send a
formerly
drone to
invincible
A's boring
barbarian
man's house,
army,
please?
driving them
Mods.
out of Latium for good and recovering the Roman gold. Camillus then basks in the glow of Roman adulation as the screen fades to black and the credits roll. A nice story, but complete fiction.
Jonathan Frakes
Regardless
telling
of
me it's
whether Roman
complete
honor
fiction.
was saved at the last moment by miraculous intervention or not, the fact remained that the city was in ruins. At some point during the siege, a fire had started, and the city was gutted by an uncontrolled blaze.
Well,
The surviving Romans, penniless and faced with the prospect of completely rebuilding their city, despaired that it was even possible, and began to speak of abandoning the Seven Hills altogether and moving en masse to Veii, where they could start afresh. Camillus strongly opposed this idea and gave an impassioned speech for the people to rebuild Rome and not flee in the face of adversity. To leave would be an admission of weakness and a moral failing. To stay would prove that Rome could never be defeated. The people, facing a choice between practical logistics and theoretical duty, remained unconvinced. But as the Senate was proceeding with the debate, a company of soldiers returning from guard duty stopped in the forum, and their commander ordered a halt, saying, "Well, we may as well stop here." The senators overheard this and, never ones to ignore a clear omen, immediately closed the debate and rejected all further proposals to abandon the city.
No, guys, we're not
Rebuilding
gonna
would begin
abandon
at
the
once,
city.
no matter the cost or difficulty. Rome was here to stay. The history of Rome is bookended by barbarian sacks. It would be 850 years before another foreign invader stepped foot in the city. By then, Rome had risen, crested, declined, and was in the process of failing. Brennus' sack of Rome, on the other end, ushered in Rome's era of dominance. Until the sack, Rome was merely one among many in Italian politics, fighting and winning, but also dealing with setbacks and defeats. After the destruction of Rome, the Romans were reborn along with the physical city they lived in. It would be a more determined, more consciously imperial citizen body that would emerge in the 300s BC. The Romans would never again find themselves under the yoke of a foreign power, nor their walls breached by an invading force. When, in the 400s AD, the Visigoths and then the Vandals finally sacked the city, the level of despair was grossly inflated because the inviolability of the city had been taken for granted. Other cities changed hands, were occupied, or expelled occupiers. This was the natural ebb and flow of ancient politics.
yeah.
But Rome itself would be eternally free, granted special status by the gods. The Vandal sack, for all the physical damage it did, destroyed Rome psychologically, a blow from which it never recovered.
Is it like a mind break?
And this sense of invincibility was born
Rome
in
got
the
mind
aftermath
broken by
of
the
the last
Visigoths.
barbarian sack, 850 years earlier. The Gallic victory humiliated, offended, and horrified the Romans who endured it, and they vowed to never let it happen again. They successfully kept their word for almost 1,000 years, a remarkable feat in the perilous and violent world of antiquity. Roman obstinacy, steadfast endurance, and unflinching resolve. A commitment to existence born
I'm doing
out
a
of
huge
near
jerk
total
off gesture, by
destruction.
the way, right now.
From a practical standpoint, the sack also brings to an end the period of early Roman history about which we have no clear records or primary sources. Though all the previous records were lost in the fire, the Romans simply started again, leaving us a wealth of documentation that puts our understanding of their history on much firmer footing from this point on. I am thankful to say that the legend of Rome has finally ended, and the history of Rome has begun. Next
Maybe
week,
that's why
the Romans begin the slow process of rebuilding.
Like, I'm
Their
wondering
task
if he
was
goes through different
complicated by the fact
episodes
that all their
slower
enemies
than other ones
passed-
because he has more history available to him, or if he goes through them slower just because he like got through the basic history really fast from beginning to end and then goes back and gets more detailed. But it sounds like
Present
we're going to get more
would attempt
detailed.
to take advantage of their weakened state. The Volscians and Aequians, of course, attacked, as always.
Roman centrists be
but
like, I
Latin
don't believe in
allies revolted
politics.
as
Gets
well,
fucking
and even some of
sieged.
Rome's own colonies decided the time was ripe to throw off the yoke of their mother city. But Camillus, not called the second founder of Rome for nothing, would lead the Romans to triumph
Not
and
for
restore
nothing.
them on their inevitable path to glory.
Alright, let's get another episode of this going.
Excuse me.
Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome.
Hello, everyone.
At the opening of the 6th book of his
What if
monumental
Markiplier just came
history
on
of
all of a
Rome
sudden?
since its foundation, Livy wrote, "The history of the Romans from the foundation of the city to its capture, first under kings, then under consuls and dictators, decemviri and consular tribune, wars abroad and dissensions at home, I have set out in 5 books, covering matters which were obscure, both through their great antiquity,
Like, what if he
objects
just came on and
dimly
said,
perceived in the far distance,
Hello, everybody. My name is
because in
Markiplier.
those days there were
Hello,
few
everybody.
written
My-
records,
Oh, no,
the only
Markiplier, stop.
reliable
You already
means of
said that.
preserving the
Oh,
memory
God,
of
he's so
past
old.
events. A further reason was the loss of most of such accounts as
Hello,
were preserved
Markiplier.
in the commentaries
He's so
of the
handsome.
pontiffs and other public and private records when the city was destroyed by fire. From now on, a clearer and more reliable account can be given of the city's civil and military history after it made a second start.
Is he still
reborn,
scared
as
of
it were,
mannequins,
from
everybody?
its old roots with increased vigor and
Is
productivity.
he all like, oh, mannequins, oh my god, mannequins.
That seems like a good place to start this week. Rome was devastated. The city was in ruins, and the population,
Roman
what remained
Markiplier
of
be
it
like,
anyway,
was that the siege of
despaired.
Rome?
Officially, the subject of abandoning Rome had been closed, but unofficially, the idea was still a potent force. Why rebuild when perfectly good homes sat vacant in a well-positioned, defensible city? The Romans had been merciless in their annihilation of the Veiites,
Am I getting an
and the
echo?
Etruscan city was practically a ghost town. But the Senate's mind was made up, and the Romans were ordered to rebuild,
Like, it's
each
fine.
according to their means.
Just trying to imagine what
Camillus,
kind of
whom the people now looked
sound
upon as
environment
twice
he's in
their
right now.
savior, if we believe the legends, stood firm behind staying in Rome, and the population, some reluctantly, followed their hero's
finally
lead.
back.
The new Rome that would grow out of the ashes of the Gallic sack would be recognizable today, with its haphazard streets and deep tangled neighborhoods clearly devoid of any central planning. There was in fact no planning whatsoever. The Romans simply picked up what material they could salvage and began rebuilding wherever the whims of each individual directed. Rome, and I say this with love,
Giving him a
is,
yucky
and
stain
has
couch
been
because
since
he's
the
yucky.
380s BC, a
He's like in a
convoluted
green
mess
room.
that
It's
defies
fine, so it'd
logic.
be a little yucky.
The irony being that in almost every other town, city, or camp built by the Romans, rational right angles was the norm. A model was developed for the fortified military camp that centered around bisecting perpendicular roads that was copied in almost every other settlement the Romans established. A centurion encamped in Britain would have been able to easily navigate his way around a camp in Syria. Everywhere the Romans went, they took their standard grid city layout with them. But the Eternal City itself was the dark city of this Roman Type A OCD. And the roots of that chaos lay in the years after the Gallic sack.
Okay,
where the
everybody, you
Romans
have
rebuilt
to be nice to
quickly,
Rome.
but without any
okay,
kind of
they're
master
literally
plan.
neurodivergent and a minor.
Not that this is necessarily the Romans' fault. As they were attempting to rebuild their shattered city, nearly every one of their formerly subdued enemies took their shot at setting themselves free of the Roman hegemony. As I mentioned at the end of last week, the usual suspects, particularly the Volscians, reappeared, but longtime allies now rose up as well. Piling it on Rome became the fad du jour among long disgruntled Latin communities, who never got over Rome's breaking up of the Latin League 100 years earlier at the Battle of Lake Regillus. Even colonies set up by Rome with strong ties to the city joined in the rebellions and kicked their mother city while she was down.
Pretty funny.
While trying to put their lives back together, the Romans kept being recalled to arms, now to fight on this front, now to fight that enemy, now to fight this former friend. It is no wonder the city grew so haphazardly. There was barely enough time to nail down
we
the
gotta get
roof
this
before it
ink.
was time to go and fight again.
How could I forget?
Throughout these years, Camillus was the rock behind which the insecure Romans hid. In times of danger, they turned to him again and again to lead them to victory. Whether he was appointed official dictator, as he was in 389, 368, and for the fifth and final time, 367 BC,
They fucking
or
love this
whether he was
Camillus guy.
elected as one of the military tribunes for that year, Camillus was unquestionably the leader of Rome. Everyone relied upon his strategic and tactical brilliance to see them through these dark times. His enemies, and he did have a few, accused him of arrogance, of treating his fellow tribunes as if they were his vassals, not his equals. But the people were indifferent to these accusations. Camillus was their man. Plus, the other commanders did little to inspire the people's confidence. At one point, a tribune leading a legion against an allied army of Latins and Volscians saw his army flee in terror and hide behind their camp walls. Camillus was ordered to take command, and, by his very presence, instilled the soldiers with enough confidence to march back out and defeat the enemy they thought so powerful. Camillus dominated his time, and it would be another 150 years until anyone emerged to equal him in the pantheon of Roman heroes. That man, Scipio Africanus, who delivered the Romans from the
Good ol'
scourge of Hannibal,
Scipio.
is often mentioned in the same breath as Camillus, and indeed, the consensus opinion is that later historians, Plutarch and Livy especially, colored their descriptions of Camillus to make him seem a prelude to the great Scipio of Africa. But as Camillus remained in the people's high esteem, another hero fell from grace.
Scipio, skipping stone.
Marcus Manlius Capitolanus, the last name attached in honor of his bravery during the Gallic siege, would soon find himself etched into Roman
Plutarch
history,
Weatherby,
not as a great hero,
stop.
but as a villain. After the withdrawal of the Gauls,
talk Weatherby.
Manlius' ego was severely bruised by the honors heaped upon Camillus, and he took them as a personal insult. Had he and the others not held out against the Gauls, Camillus never would have had the opportunity to save them. Surely that deserves some glory.
Yeah.
But Camillus hogged it all.
Well, he hogged it all,
Manlius was one of the
everybody.
few amongst the citizen body who could not stand the sight of Camillus, who he considered to be a pompous fraud. This aggravation led Manlius to break ranks with his fellow patricians and take up the cause of the plebes. By making himself their champion, Manlius hoped to do an end run around Camillus and earn the acclaim he felt he deserved.
He deserved that acclaim.
The most pressing issue of the day was debt relief. Obviously, as the Romans rebuilt, there was a hefty amount of borrowing going on, and the interest payments began to bankrupt the population. Every day saw men hauled off to prison for defaulting on loans. Men who had fought at Veii and stood firm against the Gauls were daily being made slaves by moneylenders who showed no mercy or compassion. Manlius spoke out publicly in favor of relief and often paid the debts of former soldiers out of his own pocket and offered interest-free loans to any who asked. The patricians were disturbed by Manlius's new image as the savior of the people, not only because they saw him as letting irresponsible debtors off the hook, but also because he constantly slipped in references to the great untapped strength of the populace and how their numerical superiority ought to count for something in the formation of policy. The patricians saw these as veiled and not so veiled threats against the established order, and began to see Manlius as a revolutionary figure. Manlius was arrested once on charges of bringing false claims of theft against the moneylenders, but public outcry was so great that they were forced to release him. With peace abroad to allow for real public unrest, riots began to break out between patrician and plebe factions.
We
Manlius
have to
offering
stay at
daily
war, or
harangues
else the
against
plebes are going to
tyranny of the
be
nobles, and
realize they have
offering
a shit
himself
deal.
as the only patrician who cared
Sound
about his
familiar?
fellow citizens.
Damn.
The implication was clear. Throw out the Senate
So
and
real.
elect a new democratic
Oh shit, he was a
government with
communist,
me
and
as your
they
leader.
killed him.
Finally, Unable to take it anymore, the patricians again arrested Manlius, this time on charges of sedition and treason. The trial of Manlius would become famous for the way it would play out. The trial was originally held on the Campus Martius, which lay in the shadow of the Capitoline Hill. During his defense, Manlius was able to stretch his hand up to the hill and remind the people of his great service to the city, asking how anyone could possibly believe he was now engaged in treason. The argument was having its effect, so the savvy patricians adjourned the trial to a different location. Now, without the Capitoline as a backdrop, the charges and evidence against Manlius stood on their own merits. Public opinion turned against Manlius, who, it became obvious, was engaged in an active conspiracy to overthrow the Senate.
Oh,
The verdict was
okay, well,
swift
pretty
and
funny.
harsh. He was to be thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, a
Yeah.
steep cliff on the Capitoline Hill used for executions,
Yeah.
ironically dying in disgrace a few feet from where he had achieved his greatest glory. The death of Manlius did nothing to end plebeian unrest, however. Manlius saw an opportunity and exploited it. He did not create the conditions for that opportunity. The plebes' overriding concern at this point were, as we have seen, debt relief. But the old standbys of
Debt
land
relief?
distribution and access to political power rose again. The former
Those
problem was wrapped up in the latter
irresponsible
two,
debtors,
and the
how could
plebes
they
began
get
to
themselves
focus their
into
energy on the
debt?
land and power questions. Both the land taken from VA in the north and
Time's
the
a
land taken from
circle.
the Volscians in the south conspicuously wound up in the hands of a few patrician landowners rather than being divided up amongst the masses. How were the people supposed to pay off their debts when they were denied the income land provided? Further, how was it that state policy had granted so much to so few? Obviously, the concessions that had been made to the plebes in the past had lost their potency. The plebes finally saw the office of military tribune with consular power for what it was, an attempt to water down plebe authority and deny them access to the consulship.
Hey,
the
wait a
ultimate
fucking
balance of the
second.
state. One man in particular, a patrician with 2 daughters, took it upon himself to end once and for all this unbalance. Marcus Fabius Ambustus, a
Fabius.
patrician who enjoyed plebe support, had married his eldest daughter to an influential patrician,
Whew.
and his youngest
Thank
to a
God they
wealthy
didn't stop the
plebe
sentence
named
there.
Gaius Licinius Polo. The younger daughter complained that she would never receive the honors her elder sister received on account of her husband's plebe status.
Sorry.
Fabius, the story goes, promised his daughter she would have everything her sister had and began working with his son-in-law Licinius to break the patrician stranglehold on the consulship. They began by pointing out to people that despite plebe access to the office of military tribune, no plebe had been elected to said office
I
for the last
can't
decade,
marry this
which was
plebe,
true.
not when there's so much
They then
class
demanded a
conflict.
permanent return to the dual consulship, with the stipulation that one of the consuls had to be a plebe.
We must make the plebes
Licinius
equal.
got himself elected tribune of the plebes, an office that had fallen into some
Best.
disrepute, and used his veto power to bring government business to a standstill. He promised to veto everything in sight, including
okay.
the yearly elections, until his demands were met. In addition to access to the consulship, Licinius also demanded that a cap be put on the total amount of land a man could own, as well as regulations on interest
Holy
rates.
shit.
It was this shutdown, engineered
He's
by
shutting down the
Fabius and
Airbnbs,
Licinius,
folk.
that Livy uses to explain his chronological gap, stating that between 375 and 370 BC, no magisterial elections were held. Though the duration and excess of the standoff is no doubt exaggerated, the outcome is not. The plebes finally gained access to the consulship. The moment would not come without a final appearance of the
Happy
great
for them.
Camillus, however. The civil unrest and power vacuum led to calls for a dictator, and the Senate named Camillus, who enjoyed the support of everyone, patrician and plebe alike. They were hoping Camillus would see things their way, but much to their discomfort, he did not. Now, due to a flaw in the appointment ceremony, a religious event stuffed full with every kind of Roman superstition, Camillus was forced to resign for that year, granting a reprieve of sorts
You
to
guys
the clearly
fucked it.
defensive patricians. The next year, though, 367 BC, Camillus was again named dictator for the 5th and final time. He used his power to broker the deal Licinius and his colleagues demanded, and for the first time, a
Holy
plebe
shit,
would be elected
power
consul.
brokers. It's just like that
The
one
crisis
Mass
settled,
Effect
Camillus
DLC that I
resigned.
never finished.
The old Roman leader died soon after, the victim of a plague
Actually,
that
no, I did finish
decimated the
that one.
Romans in the 360s BC. With his death, a new era dawned. The Romans had survived their brush with death and emerged a strong,
God, remember
more
a
democratic place.
pre-microtransactions universe?
The honor of
Do you remember the
plebe
first
consul
couple of
historically goes to
microtransactions?
Lucius Sextius, one of Licinius's
Mass
colleagues who
Effect
had helped engineer the shutdown.
Firewalker.
The land ownership
Colors.
ceiling and
I'm back in
regulation
who
of
the
debt
fuck?
were granted at the same time, and
We have created a
ironically,
guy. Well,
Licinius
I mean, we've
himself
drawn
would
a
be
guy.
prosecuted years later for violating his own laws after he sought to accumulate large tracts of land for himself and his family. At this
my
point,
lord,
the law
he
stated
didn't
merely
practice
that
what
one
he
of the consuls
preached.
could be a plebe.
feed him to the
Later,
lions.
around 342 BC, a law would be passed stating that one of the consuls had to be a plebe. For now, though, the plebes accepted the obvious victory and passed to the next generation the task of not simply allowing equal access to power, but guaranteeing it. The veracity of this patrician-plebe showdown and the election of a first plebeian consul in 367 BC
Extremely based.
has been called into question by modern historians.
Huh.
In the first place, they point out that Roman historians of the late Republic and early imperial period were obviously drawing their narrative from more recent events, specifically the conflicts that centered around the Gracchi brothers, who used their veto power to try and force through land redistribution in the 130s and 120s BC. Second, modern analysis has determined that as many as a third of the consuls prior to 367 were in fact of plebeian origin. As is so often the case, a clear dramatic delineation in history is less plausible than a gradual shift in policy over the years. There is no doubt that the vast majority of early consuls were patricians, but it is suspected that this was not the result of overt discrimination, but rather because of the greater wealth and fame of patrician candidates. The 367 BC date is important, though, because from that point on there is a marked
Interesting.
increase in plebe consuls, demonstrating some sort of conscious decision to grant plebeians more power. And of course, the existence of a 342 BC law stipulating that one of the
Don't know if I like
consuls
that
had to be a
last layer
plebe
of color
is
too
not
much.
disputed, and it seems likely that this was
Just
the
keep it
culmination of a
simple.
decades-long shift rather
A
than
hint
a
at
bolt out
tones.
of the
This
blue.
guy's gonna shoot me, isn't
In
he?
general,
Oh yeah.
what can be stated is that
He will
after
kill
the
a bitch,
sack
as
of
I've
Rome,
been-
the plebes
we've confirmed
demanded
with
and
Wild.
received far greater power than they had enjoyed prior to the arrival of the Gauls.
Oh, scallop.
The Romans struggled in the years
This guy's
after the
gonna
Gauls
fucking
left them
shoot
for
me,
dead,
isn't he,
but
Sponge?
managed to hold on in the
Squid
face
raid.
of massive external
think you're dead
pressure
fucking
and
meat.
internal dissension.
Wouldn't that be crazy
The
if
new
that happened in SpongeBob?
enfranchisement of the plebes made the Romans a more cohesive and less divisive society. This cohesion would be tested by a confrontation that loomed on the horizon. Though the Romans did not know it yet, they were about to begin a series of war that would leave them the dominant force not just in Latium or central Italy,
Then consider me bitch.
but in the entire peninsula. Next week, we will introduce the Samnites, the fiercest of all the hill tribes,
Me.
who would not only prove more than a match for Rome, but also force the Romans to rethink everything they knew about warfare. The Romans would fight a single
So
great war
based.
with three distinct phases against the Samnites between
Maybe on, like, a bad
343
night.
and 295 BC.
You could put yourself in his
The
crosshairs, though.
Samnite Wars would pull all the major powers of Italy onto one side or the other, and
Me
culminate
pulling
with
out
the
a
largest
napkin
battle
and
ever
like
fought on Italian
putting
soil.
a
When
wrong
it was
swastika
over,
on
the
it,
Roman
like an
victory
upside
was
down
so
reverse
complete
swastika
that
on
it
it,
would be
like
200 years before an Italian people
I
again
hope no
mounted
one
a
shoots
serious
me.
threat to Roman rule. And by that time, Rome had grown into a global empire the Italians were not trying to topple, but rather gain full legal citizenship within.
Alright, I think I'll wrap this one up and we'll do a little bit of a bonus. And we'll draw a little Gianni slime girl. I have a normal Gianni slime girl idea and then like the cool Gianni slime girl idea that I think is actually genius and everybody's gonna like. Okay. Here's my genius idea for a Gianni slime girl. Let's see if I can paint it within holding my breath. I don't know why I'm putting in that challenge. I have to like practice holding my breath more for fucking lifeguarding, so I try and get it in whenever I can. Okay. I don't know, gamers. I got like a tickle in my throat. Still holding it. There's my cool Gianni idea. Wait. Okay, there's the Gianni slime girl. This is just Ditto with boobs. Ship it. Wait, I gotta make them blue. Ugh, oh, God. That was a really bad breath hold. It was not good. There we go. Okay, now that's Gianni. Yeah. Okay, let's actually do a Gianni slime girl. Although it's going to be more like a Smiley Blue slime girl, I think. We're mixing a lot of genres with this one. Italian, bomb, slime, streamer. But I think we can do it. Let's get another podcast going. Ooh, hey, this was just gonna be a torso up, God. No more full bodies. I keep doing this to myself. I'm like, yeah, I can do another full body, and it turns out great. I always manage to get it done in time, and it's not like I'm not rushing. Oh,
Hello,
turning you down.
and welcome to the history of Rome. In a single generation, Rome had recovered from the devastation of the Gallic sack and regained its dominant position within the region. The plebes had demanded and received greater political power, culminating with the election of the first plebe consul in 366 BC, the year after Camillus shepherded the Licinian law through the Senate. I did not mention this last week, but the admittance of plebes into the consulship also saw the end of military tribunes with consular power as one of the highest offices of state. The dual consulship was reinstated for good, and the obsolete office of military tribune was never revived. Subsequent years would see other plebe firsts, including the first plebe dictator in 356 BC and the first plebe censor in 351 BC. Both feats achieved by a single man, Gaius Marcius Rutulus, who, over the course of his illustrious career, would also be elected consul 4 times. By 343 BC, the Romans were once again seen as the great force in central Italy, and, as we are about to see, this meant that their neighbors forever sought to involve them in squabbles that had nothing to do with Rome or Roman interests.
How do I
The
make
Romans were
a
the big kid on the
fucking,
block
like
every
the
other kid
mono
wanted on their
pupils
side.
look at something? I guess the reflections.
As I
kinda
did
do
last
it.
time, I would like to open this week with a quote from Livy, discussing the
Libby.
year hostilities began with the Samnites and its significance in the greater arc of Roman history. From now on, the wars described will be of greater importance. Our enemies were more powerful, and campaigns lasted longer and were mounted in remote areas.
Huge.
For this
boob.
was the year when an attack was launched
huge.
against the Samnites,
Gianni or
a people
huge
who were
breasts.
strong both in resources and in arms. After the Samnite War, which was inconclusive, Pyrrhus was the enemy, and after him,
Huge
the
breasts, but also
Carthaginians.
like fucking.
What a series
massive
of momentous
arms.
events. How often we were in mortal danger to enable us to raise up our empire to its present
Huge
heights of
boob,
grandeur,
Gianni.
where only with difficulty it is sustained. Rome was on the precipice of its rise to greatness. The Samnites, as I've said previously,
Oh, I don't have to draw
were a
fingers with a slime
semi-nomadic
either.
tribe from
Fuck
the
yeah.
south-central section of the Apennines called Samnium. Starting in the 300s BC, the Samnites, along with a number of other hill tribes, began to come down out of the hills and onto the plains that lay between the mountains and the coastline. Some moved south and began to encroach
Bigger.
on the Greek
Bigger.
cities of
Okay.
Magna Graecia. Others, like the Samnites, began to move west and came down to a land known as Campania, which lay southeast of Rome. The Greeks in the south sent envoys across the Adriatic to beg for assistance in fighting off the hill tribes, and were answered by Alexander of Epirus, who sent an army to help rid the Greeks of the encroaching menace. As we will see later, this introduction of an army from Epirus would have far-reaching consequences for the Romans. 60 years later, an army from Epirus would again answer Greek calls for aid, only this time not to battle nomadic hill tribes,
Damn, girls
but
really
rather
do be
the
like
growing
peak
power of Rome.
design, don't they?
But we still have a ways to go before we get to that.
Men are pretty cool too. Don't get
The
me wrong.
largest and most important city in Campania, where the Samnites were setting up shop, was Capua. Known for its rich soil and soft lifestyle, Capua was no match for the hardened Samnite warriors, so, like the Greeks,
Hardened.
they cast about for a savior.
Everything is peak design.
Envoys were
Not gonna
sent
lie.
to the
Base
largest and
take.
strongest power in the region,
That's the
Rome,
wisest take of
to
them
beg
all.
for aid. The Romans, however, turned the envoys away. Rome had already concluded a treaty with the Samnites and could not in good conscience break it. They had, after all, sworn oaths before the gods.
Guys,
The desperate
we
Capuans
swore
then
oaths
took an
before the gods,
extraordinary
okay? We can't
step.
break that.
They formally surrendered Capua, its land and citizens, to Rome, willingly making themselves subjects of Rome. The Senate could not look this massive gift horse in the mouth. The land controlled by Capua was some of the best in Italy, and the food it could provide would put the days of grain famine in the rearview mirror forever. The Romans accepted the surrender and sent their own envoys to Samnium, where they explained that Capua was now Roman territory and, as per their treaty, the Samnites must desist all attacks. The Samnites would have
You
none
actually
of
have
this
to
and
desist
scoffed at
all
the
your
Roman envoys,
attacks.
taking the insulting step of ordering a raid into Campania right in front of the Roman legates. The Romans, offended by this obvious breach of protocol, felt they had no choice at this point but to declare war,
Oh my god.
and so the First Samnite War began.
Guys,
The two consuls for that year, 343 BC by our reckoning, were Aulus Cornelius Cassus, a capable if forgettable leader, and Marcus Valerius
Ouch.
Corvus,
Hey,
a
he's
true
alright.
blue member of the legendary Roman Heroes Club. He was a member of the prominent Valerian family, whose famous ancestral patriarch was Publius Valerius Publicola himself. The surname Corvus, or Raven, was earned as a young man while serving in the army. The legions were squaring off against an army of Gauls when a huge Gallic fighter stepped forward and challenged any Roman to single combat. Young Marcus Valerius, all of 22, stepped forward and accepted the challenge. As he approached the Gaul, a raven landed on his shoulder, a sign that the gods favored him. The Gaul was worried by this clear omen, but proceeded with the fight anyway. And
guys,
the
are you
raven,
sure he's
far
got a
from
bird
leaving
on
when
his
the clash
shoulder?
began, actually joined in, pecking at the Gaul's eyes while Valerius ran him through with his sword.
Holy shit! Just like
Valerius
Roland
triumphant,
Deschain.
the raven flew off.
That's
the
a
legions
Dark
then
Tower
swept into
reference.
the
I didn't
Gallic
know
line
Rome was a
and
fan of
defeated
Stephen
them
King.
almost without
Those
resistance.
thighs can kill a man. Peak.
And auspicious, if obviously embellished,
they can.
beginning to a career to say the least.
Gianni's
Corvus
thighs
would
could
be
actually
elected
kill a
consul
man.
for the first time the very next
Like,
year.
if anybody
at the
ever wants to be
unprecedented
euthanized or
age
something
of
like that, look no
23.
further.
Before dying at the also unprecedented age of 100, he would be elected consul 5 more times and named dictator twice. But getting back to the war with the Samnites, Corvus was sent to protect Campania, and his colleague Cassus was sent to invade Samnium. Between the two, they figured to have the Samnites at heel in no time. Corvus was the first to meet the enemy, and after a fierce battle at the base of Mount Garus, fiercer than the Romans expected, the Samnites were routed.
Gianni should get a job
It
as a
was not an
professional
easy
thigh
victory,
euthanizer
and
by the
put the Romans
Canadian
on
government.
notice that they were not fighting Volscian raiders anymore.
Made Mastrograno assisted
Cassus, in Samnium,
death.
almost blundered his way into the destruction of his own army, but was saved by one of his tribunes. The
Yeah, let's
consul
look up
led
some
his army
pictures,
into
some
a
slime
ravine
videos
and noticed
to,
only
to
too
get
late
a
that the
little bit of a
Samnites
slime
had taken
texture
up a
on here.
position
Maybe
on
not a
the
video,
ridge
maybe
and
just
stood
a
ready
picture.
to shower them with projectiles. One of his tribunes, Publius Decius, noticed that the Samnites were positioned in the shadows of a steep hill, and if a company of Romans could take the hill, then they would be able to pin down the Samnites, allowing the legions to escape.
This was such a good suggestion.
Cassus
Thank you,
immediately
A. Is a
ordered
boring name.
Decius and a detachment
I'm gonna
of
send this to
volunteers
Gianni. He's gonna be like,
execute the plan.
"Oh,
Decius slipped up and took the hill
I'm gonna
before
need
the
to bring
Samnites
this into my
realized what was
office for
going
a
on,
minute."
and immediately began pelting the Samnites with missiles. In
Holy
the
shit! They had
confusion,
missiles. They had
Cassus
V2
was able
rockets.
to withdraw his army to safety, but Decius was left on the hill, surrounded by an army of angry Samnites who had just been denied an easy victory. Secure on the high
To
ground,
you,
the Roman
bitch.
detachment was able to hold out until nightfall, at which point, recognizing their hopeless position, they decided to risk death by sneaking through the
Purple
Samnite army
slime.
rather than remaining on the
Let's see,
hill
I want
and
some
safely
transparent
starving to
stuff.
death. They'd gone about halfway through the camp.
None
when
of
one
these
the
look good
soldiers dropped his
as
shield
good
on
as
a
the
sleeping
YouTube
Samnite.
short slimes
Decius
here.
immediately began yelling at his men to attack anything that moved. The Samnites, half asleep and panicked by the sudden violent commotion, did not know what or
One day I'm
who
gonna
to
buy
attack.
slimes. I swear to fucking
Decius
God.
and his men made a break through the army, killing everything in their path. When they emerged on the other side, Decius took a head count
Okay,
and
hold up,
realized
gamers.
to his great pleasure that of the company of
We have
men
to.
he led
We
on-
have to watch slime videos. Okay, one second. Let me just save this. I'm just calling this commission A. Or request commission. I don't know. All right, slimes. Let's see.
Rating the versatility of the scoopability of this week's slimes.
Oh, Jesus. Whoa. Holy shit, they're just ripping farts. My god. You can't fucking fool me. You just, you're using this to hide your, microphone implanted in the employee bathroom. I think that first one's probably going to be our best reference, but...
Viet New Year.
No. No.
And-
No.
Like this, like in?
No. Sunflower seed slime? What the fuck? Okay. See, they'll usually do like a compilation, so, okay.
We really thought that
No. No.
new spot.
No! Oh god, it's the same videos, come on! I cannot fast forward in this video, we're just gonna have to live with it, folks. This is like a good color, but I need it to be more transparent. Or more opaque. Too opaque. It smells like dirt. That makes it a 10 out of 10, folks. That blue one is legit, Gianni. A little darker. It just needs to be a little darker. Okay, the color match doesn't have to be real. But I'm like, texture match? Ooh. Okay. Oh. Teeth. Froggy fried rice? Mermaid waffle. Dill pickle. Oh. The fuck did I come back? We are literally, I'm trying to get reference, like video or like photographic reference for this Gianni slime we did, but I don't think I'm gonna need it. I think I'm just gonna give up. Sulfur monoxide. What the fuck? Okay.
How to play with clear slimes.
Okay.
Clear slimes are the tackiest slime texture.
Okay.
If you pull away too slowly, it will stick to you.
Okay.
You have to handle it quickly, like this. Use
Like
fast
this.
motions. Pretend the slime is hot. If you touch it for too long, it will burn you.
Draw the scene with that same from Flubber
Let's
for shaking its
practice.
ass. Yeah.
Handle it quickly.
Okay, one more video. I'm not addicted to watching slime videos, you guys. It's fine.
Potato sprouts. Garden BB trio.
I should get a slime. I should play with the slime. Boiling my husband alive. Okay, I'm just using the breast implant one. You know what? I'm not even gonna fucking look at it. We don't need this shit. We don't need any of this stupid fucking technology, dog. Alright, the slime girls are in our hearts. We can just make it up as we go along. Who gives a shit? Fuck. Getting very passionate about this. How hard could it be? How hard could it be to fake a slime texture really quick with a couple of brush? It's probably easy. Help. How is or was your day? Folks have been coming in and asking, no problem, but thank you. It's going pretty good. I got some work to do after this, which I'm like, I don't want to do any work. I want to go play House Flipper, but can't complain. It's been pretty all right. How are you guys? I haven't asked you guys how your days are going. It's because I'm the streamer and I control this conversation. But how is everybody's day?
Yes. Bionicle.
Tash is so good at fake text to speech. Like, it's actually insane. Like, they should just hire her for, like, every single TikTok video that ever happened. They should just hire her to voice it, you know? Ooh, kind of like that purple.
This is just like purple slime ASMR.
Wait, we gotta give her the tank top. Oops. Slime Girl Gianni. Oh, I wish such a thing could be real. Dare not trust a hope. I'd put on the history of Rome, but I'm going to be done this in like the next 5 minutes. And I don't want to be distracted from Slime Girl Gianna. I think my favorite brand of Gianni content is just the random comments on some of his videos that's just like, did you know that he also plays a hot synth in a porn game? And then someone invariably says, what does his wife think? And then everybody's like, Gianni's not gay? Which, I mean, fair. But that's still just my absolute fucking favorite. I love it so much. That's pretty crazy. What does the old ball and chain think? What does the old nagger say? What's the old what's another derogatory word for a wife? Okay, now we gotta add shine. Too shine. Would Slime Girl Gianni ever wear a Smiley Bomb strap-on? I don't think I need to answer that. I think we know the answer here. Listen, Gianni has been granted the honorary lesbian award by lesbians. So I'm pretty sure it's safe to say that actually looks really cute. Oh my god. I need my government mandated slime wife. Holy shit. I feel hungry for something I've never tasted, you know? Slime girl. Okay, new merch idea. I should be Gianni's manager. Hire a slime artist to make a Gianni Matrigrano slime. I'd buy that slime. Put little, it could be a clear slime or something, and it has little smiley bombs in it or something like that. I bet you could buy little blue smiley faces on fucking Amazon or whatever they use for add-ins. She kind of looks like a loaded condom. Maybe I'll add some stripes to the... Hold on. I wasn't really sure how I would stylize the explosion, but I guess I could just do one of these. or like y'all ever do that thing where you go around with a pack of condoms and a carton of cream and you you throw it on people's cars? Gianni Slime could be wearing it, but then the Gianni Slime could become this. I'm listening. How does fire work? Is it yellow on the outside? Orange on the inside? Why is that color mute? Oh yeah, it's because I got all this stupid stuff in there. No, it's like yellow and white on the inside and then orange on the outside, isn't it? I don't know colors. Oh no, wait, it's being completely suppressed by this. There we go. Okay. Color? I barely even know her. Oh my god, she's so cute. Oh my god.
My new wife. Everybody, I'd like you to meet my new wife. Slimy Bomb.
Oh my god, she's so cute. Chad, help me. Oh my god. Oh, I could just eat her up. The hotter it is, the brighter, especially in the center. Yes. That is correct. Sorry, what are we posting on your main? This can go on your main account. If you're thinking of drawing some kind of Gianner strap, I know I can't retweet that, or I wouldn't retweet that on my main account. This though, this I'm putting on my main. Even though I know the reaction to it's going to be like, wood. You can link it here. Yeah, we got a mature label on here, right? She will bounce around your stomach. Don't eat her up. That's just like in Flubber. Yeah, you can't eat the Flubber. He'll fuck you up, dog. That was like a body horror scene. And then he blasted out the guy's ass. Oh my gosh. Like actually a horror movie. I recently-ish rewatched it, and what a bad fucking movie. I think I watched the original too. Except I think the original Flubber wasn't alive, or maybe it was, but it was like a black ball of rubber. I think it was a black and white film. Smiley boobs. Smiley bomb face boob. Okay, wait. I can find this. Smiley bomb face boobs cannot leave your mind. I don't. If it doesn't have a set of nipples on it, it's not mature. Right. I mean, as illogical as that is. Okay. I think I'm going to post this one on Twitter like right now, live on air, and then we're going to wrap this stream up. And I'm going to send it to Gianni. Actually, no, I'll send it to Gianni first. We'll see how he likes it. Now, what's an appropriate... Yeah, there we go. What the fuck? J-Fif. No, wait. It's okay, everybody. It's okay, we're fixing it. We're fixing it. We're fixing it. We're fixing it. Don't panic. Don't panic. Don't tell Mom. Don't tell Mom. Yes. Oh, that looks so good. I am like a god. Those AI freaks are right to fear us. Also, I hope that Discord doesn't open in the wrong window. Oh, okay. We're good. Oh, I'm so smart. Just a banger after banger with my work, isn't it? I truly am the best artist in the universe. So what if we... God. Oh, we're good, okay. Every time I unplug this headset to stop it charging, it switches over the inputs. It didn't used to do that, but... Booby. Alright, what's chat saying here? Spaghetti without noodles. Boobs without tits. Male presenting nipples. Yeah. Just say male, just put it in red font at the top. Punished for slime crimes. Just trying to see if Gianni likes it. He's like working right now. Chat, I don't think he's going to react in time before I turn you all off. But, why would a slime have nipples anyway? Because you could just drink the whole slime. You could drink a slime from anywhere. This is important slime lore. Truly. Ow, my bones. I will snap every bone in my body. The slime would have nipples because it wanted to. Ask the DQ slime. What flavor is Smiley Bomb? I think like a Jello blue raspberry is fitting enough. She could have nipples anywhere she wanted, you know. Slimy Bomb is insane! Blueberry. Yeah. Blue flavored Jello is peak. Now I want Jello. Hey, anybody else looking at slime girls and getting kind of hungry? Nipples on the feet. Don't like that. Mods, can you send another drone strike? A is a boring name. I managed to dodge the first one. Can you send a whole platoon? No! Bad. Nah. Alright. Well, toe nipples instead of toenails. I will dodge all the drone strikes. I am too unhinged for anyone to handle. Oh. Gianni's gonna stream soon. Areola and all. Oh. Working mammary glands and all. Oh, no. I have to let you guys go. Badonker's even bigger, but that was cursed.
See, Garnet understands the good. What an honest, like, chicken, broccoli, and mashed potato meals Garnet is about these thoughts. What a smart, good idea. Just bigger boobs. A's boring name is like taking 12 hits out of a can of Raid. Spicy. But interesting. And I'll probably kill you. But with that, I think I'm going to ditch you all of you. I'm going to ditch you all into a pit into my backyard. I'll probably do more of the same tomorrow. As always, I will notify Twitter of when I have the slots cleared. I should have a better system because I have to save the emails so I can send these to their respective owners, but whatever. We'll figure it out. Raid mixed with an energy drink. Yeah, that's accurate. Oh. For commissioners, I'll be sending these out in a couple hours. You know what I like to do? I like to zone out for a little while before I do that. Ooh. Good to know, Trispy. I will let everybody know on Twitter. First come, first served usually, but maybe you get it. Okay, everybody. Oh, I just noticed one of her arm straps is larger than the other one. It's okay. I'll get over it. Okay, everybody be good. I will catch you probably tomorrow.